Welcome, Night Seekers, to Netheric Horror. Tonight, true scary stories, gentle narration, and soothing rain await. Relax, close your eyes, embrace the darkness, and let your nightmare journey begin forever together. If you enjoy tonight's journey, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Sweet dreams, if you can. Back in 2008, my brother, my mom, and I were visiting my grandparents. And up until the final night of that trip, everything about the visit had been genuinely pleasant. It was one of those simple, comfortable family trips, full of easy conversation and familiar routines, nothing about it suggesting in any way that anything unusual was about to happen. We had a train scheduled to take us back home the next day, so that final evening, everyone in the house turned in fairly early, wanting to be well rested for the journey ahead. What happened after we all settled in for the night, though, ended up changing something fundamental about me, in ways I still don't fully understand even now, all these years later. Looking back on that particular trip, I remember it being one of the more relaxed, uneventful visits we'd had to my grandparents' place in a while. There was nothing especially memorable about the days leading up to that final night. Just the usual comfortable rhythm of family visits, shared meals, catching up on the small, ordinary details of each other's lives, and enjoying the particular kind of quiet that only exists in a grandparent's house. A house that always feels a little slower paced and more settled than anywhere else. My grandparents' home itself was an older building, filled with the kind of creaks and small idiosyncrasies that come with age, though nothing about it had ever struck me before as unsettling or particularly strange in any specific way. We had a train scheduled early the next morning to take us back home, and because of that early departure, everyone in the house decided to turn in unusually early that final night, wanting to make sure we were all well rested before the long journey ahead. I remember feeling completely at ease as I settled into bed that evening. Nothing weighing on my mind beyond the simple, practical concern of getting enough sleep before an early wake-up call. Nothing about the atmosphere of the house that night felt any different from any other night we'd spent there throughout the trip. At exactly 11:34, a time I remember with strange, specific clarity even now, I heard the harsh, distinctive call of a crow somewhere nearby. And moments later, I actually saw the crow itself, flying through the kitchen of my grandparents' house. My first thought was simple and practical, assuming that some window must have been left open somewhere, allowing the bird to get inside by accident. I got up to check, walking into the kitchen to see if I could spot the crow and figure out where it might have come in from. But when I got there, the kitchen was completely empty. No crow anywhere in sight, no open window that I could immediately identify, nothing at all to explain the bird I had so clearly heard and seen only moments earlier. A little unsettled, but not yet particularly alarmed, I went back to my bed, where my mom was already lying beside me, fast asleep. I settled back down myself and eventually drifted off to sleep as well. The whole crow incident already starting to feel like nothing more than a strange minor oddity, the kind of thing you brush off without giving it too much additional thought. It was sometime after falling back asleep that things took a genuinely strange turn. I found myself experiencing what I can only describe as an out-of-body experience. Suddenly aware of myself, standing outside on the street near my grandparents' house, viewing everything from a vantage point completely separate from my physical body still lying asleep, inside. It's difficult even now to properly describe exactly what that sensation felt like. Being somehow simultaneously aware of my body sleeping inside while also standing outside, watching the house from a distance with a kind of clarity and detail that felt far too vivid and coherent to be an ordinary dream. From that strange, detached perspective, I saw a figure approaching the house, tall and unnaturally lean, dressed entirely in a black hooded cloak that obscured most of its features. I watched, filled with a rapidly rising sense of panic, as this figure entered the house and began climbing the stairs, moving with slow, deliberate purpose directly toward the room where my physical body was still sleeping. There was something about the sheer deliberateness of its movement that made the whole experience feel even more disturbing. Not rushed or aggressive in any obvious way, but calm and unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world to reach that room and knew exactly where it was heading without any hesitation whatsoever. I remember trying, from that strange, separated vantage point, to somehow warn myself, to shout or do something that might alert my sleeping body to the approaching danger. Though nothing I attempted from that detached perspective seemed to have any effect at all. I remember the fear building rapidly inside me as I watched this figure make its way closer and closer to where I was sleeping, completely unable to do anything to stop it or warn myself from that strange, separated vantage point outside. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, I found myself snapping back into full consciousness, my eyes opening abruptly, finding myself once again lying in my bed exactly where I'd fallen asleep, my heart racing from whatever I had just experienced. For a moment, I tried to convince myself that it had simply been an unusually vivid, unsettling dream. The kind of thing that feels intensely real in the moment, but fades quickly enough once you're fully awake and can remind yourself none of it actually happened. I tried shrugging it off entirely, telling myself firmly that there was nothing to actually worry about. But almost immediately after telling myself that, a deep, unmistakable sense of dread settled over me. An overwhelming feeling that something genuinely dark and threatening was standing just outside the bedroom door, close enough that I could somehow sense its presence there without needing to see it directly. I remember having to gather every bit of courage I had in that moment, forcing myself to actually turn and look toward the doorway despite every instinct telling me not to. And there it was, exactly as I had seen it during that strange out-of-body experience only moments earlier. Tall, unnaturally lean, its face almost entirely obscured beneath that same black hood. I could make out its eyes, though what I saw there offered no comfort at all. They were dark, completely hollow-looking, as though there was nothing behind them at all, no visible depth or life. Just empty, black voids where eyes should have been. I don't know how long I actually stared at it standing there in that doorway, though it felt, in the moment, like an impossibly long stretch of time, my entire body frozen with a fear unlike anything I had ever experienced before or since. There was something about the sheer stillness of it, standing there without moving, without making any sound at all, that somehow made the whole experience even more unbearable than if it had lunged toward me immediately. It simply stood there, watching, as though it were waiting for something, some particular moment or reaction from me before it finally moved. As I stared at it, frozen in place, the figures suddenly began to dissolve, breaking apart into what looked like fine, drifting dust, and rather than simply scattering away into nothing, that dust moved directly toward me, entering my body in a way I still struggle to fully describe or explain. Almost immediately after that happened, I started choking, my breathing turning into loud, labored wheezing that I had absolutely no control over, my chest tightening painfully as I struggled desperately just to draw in air. I remember genuinely believing, in that moment, that something inside me had fundamentally changed, that whatever that dust actually was had somehow settled itself directly into my chest, making even the simplest act of breathing feel like an enormous, painful effort. My mom, still asleep beside me until that point, woke up to the sound of my labored wheezing and immediately began trying to help, though at the time, neither of us fully understood what was actually happening or how to properly respond to it. In the midst of that terrifying struggle to breathe, every single light in the house suddenly turned on at once, all throughout the building, with no clear explanation for how or why that happened so abruptly. To this day, I have no idea what caused every light in the house to switch on simultaneously like that. Whether it was some kind of electrical surge, some other family member reacting to the sounds I was making, or something else entirely that I've never been able to explain. My grandfather rushed in shortly after, quickly gave me some kind of medicine to help calm my breathing and get me settled again, and eventually, exhausted both physically and emotionally from everything that had just happened, I managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, still shaken by the events of the previous night, my family took me to see a doctor, hoping to get some kind of explanation for the intense choking and wheezing episode I'd experienced. The doctor, after a fairly brief examination, dismissed the whole thing rather casually, suggesting it was most likely just some kind of allergic reaction, nothing particularly serious or unusual, certainly nothing connected in any way to whatever strange supernatural experience I'd actually gone through the night before. I remember not believing that explanation at all, even as a kid, feeling a strong, instinctive certainty that whatever had happened to me the previous night was something far stranger and more significant than a simple allergic reaction, regardless of how confidently the doctor tried to reassure my family otherwise. I remember sitting in that examination room, listening to the doctor speak so casually and confidently about pollen counts and seasonal allergens, and feeling a growing frustration at how completely disconnected that explanation felt from what I had actually experienced only hours earlier. There was no way, as far as I was concerned, that ordinary allergies could account for an out-of-body experience, a hooded figure with hollow eyes standing in my doorway, or the strange sensation of dust entering my body, followed immediately by an inability to breathe. But I was young, and there was little I could do beyond quietly disagreeing in my own mind, while the adults around me accepted the doctor's simpler, more comfortable explanation. As if to underscore just how wrong that dismissive diagnosis felt, almost as soon as we were leaving the doctor's office, I began developing hive-like boils all across my body, angry, raised welts that appeared seemingly out of nowhere and covered a significant portion of my skin. Those boils persisted for roughly a full week before finally fading away completely, leaving no permanent physical mark behind, though the memory of having them and the timing of their sudden appearance immediately following that terrifying night has never fully left me. My mom, understandably worried by that point, took me back to see the doctor once those boils appeared, though even then the explanation offered remained largely the same. Some variation of an allergic or stress-related skin reaction, still completely disconnected from anything resembling the actual experience I'd had that night. Even now, all these years later, I still occasionally catch sight of that same figure, tall, lean, and cloaked in black, appearing unexpectedly at various points since that original incident. It never approaches me directly the way it did that first night, and it never repeats that same unsettling process of dissolving into dust and entering my body again. It simply appears, sometimes at a distance, sometimes closer, watching silently for a brief moment before disappearing again just as suddenly as it arrived, leaving me with the same lingering unease each time, though thankfully never again with the same intensity of that original, terrifying encounter. These later sightings tend to happen at unpredictable moments, sometimes years apart, with no obvious pattern connecting them that I've ever been able to identify. A few times, I've caught sight of it standing at the edge of a room out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look directly. Other times, it's appeared more clearly, standing at a distance in a way that leaves no doubt about what I'm actually seeing, before fading away just as I begin to fully process its presence. Each time it happens, that same instinctive fear from the original encounter briefly resurfaces, even though, logically, I know, by this point, that it's never once tried to approach or harm me again since that first night. In the years since that night, a lot of things about me have genuinely changed, shifts in my personality, my outlook, and certain abilities or sensitivities I didn't seem to have before that particular trip to my grandparents' house. For the most part, those changes have been positive ones, improvements I've come to appreciate and value as I've gotten older, though I still can't say with any real confidence exactly what happened that night, or what that tall, hollow-eyed figure actually was, or why it chose that particular moment to appear and interact with me in the specific way that it did. I've noticed, for instance, that I've become noticeably more intuitive over the years about certain situations and people, a kind of heightened awareness that I don't remember having quite so strongly before that trip. I've also found myself drawn, more than I ever was previously, to learning about different spiritual and cultural traditions surrounding death, transition, and the unseen. A curiosity that feels directly tied, at least in my own mind, back to that single unexplained night. Whether those changes are genuinely connected to the encounter itself, or simply the natural result of growing older and gaining more life experience, I honestly can't say for certain, though the timing of when I first started noticing them has always felt significant to me. I've spent a considerable amount of time since then trying to research similar experiences, looking for other accounts that might match what I went through that night, hoping to find some kind of framework or explanation that would help make sense of it all. I've come across various folklore traditions from different cultures describing tall, dark, hooded figures associated with death, transition, or spiritual awakening. Though none of the specific accounts I've found have ever matched my own experience closely enough to feel like a definitive answer. Some traditions describe such figures as harbingers of death, warnings of an approaching end, entities that appear briefly before some significant loss to come. Others describe similar entities as guides of some kind, present during moments of significant spiritual transition or awakening, rather than purely malevolent forces intent on harm, appearing not to take something away, but to mark some quieter internal shift already beginning to take shape. Given that nothing genuinely tragic happened to me or my family immediately following that encounter, and given the specific, tangible personal changes I noticed in myself afterward, I found myself leaning more toward the latter interpretation over the years, though I hold that belief loosely, without any real certainty behind it, aware that I may simply be choosing the more comforting explanation over one that might genuinely be closer to the truth. What I keep coming back to, more than any specific theory or explanation, is just how vivid and consistent every detail of that night has remained in my memory over all these years. The exact time on the clock when I first heard that crow. The empty kitchen, despite clearly seeing and hearing the bird there only moments earlier. The specific unnerving sensation of watching myself from outside my own body as that figure approached the house and climbed the stairs. The hollow, empty darkness of its eyes once I finally forced myself to look directly at it, standing in my doorway. The strange, dust-like dissolution of its form as it moved into me, followed almost immediately by that terrifying inability to breathe properly. Every single detail remains sharp and consistent in my memory, refusing to blur or soften the way so many other, more ordinary memories from that same period of my childhood eventually have. I don't know, even now, what that figure actually was, or why it chose that particular night at my grandparents' house to reveal itself to me so directly and so intensely. I don't know why it continues to reappear occasionally, even now, always watching from a distance, never again approaching the way it did that first time. And I don't fully understand why so many aspects of my personality and outlook shifted so noticeably in the aftermath of that single terrifying night changes that, whatever their ultimate cause. I've genuinely come to be grateful for, as I've grown older, changes I doubt I would trade back, even if it meant erasing the fear that came alongside them that night. What I do know is that whatever happened that night was real enough, vivid enough, and significant enough that no dismissive doctor's diagnosis of a simple allergic reaction has ever come close to fully explaining it away. And I suspect, at this point, that I'll simply have to continue living alongside that unanswered mystery for the rest of my life, however uncomfortable that ongoing uncertainty continues to be. It remains, even now, the single strangest and most defining experience of my entire life, one I still find myself thinking about regularly, still turning over in my mind, still trying, without much success, to fully make sense of, even after everything I've read and everyone I've asked over all these years since. Looking back on this story now, having heard it recounted so many times over the years at family gatherings, I think part of what makes it linger so persistently in our family's collective memory is just how ordinary and gradual everything felt, right up until that one specific, terrifying night. Imaginary friends are such a common part of early childhood that none of us, myself included, whenever I imagined being in my aunt's position, would have thought much of it at first. It's the kind of story that builds slowly, detail by small, unremarkable detail, before suddenly and irreversibly turning into something else entirely. This is a genuine story about something that happened to my family almost 30 years ago, an experience that has been passed down and retold within our family many times since, always with the same unsettling details intact. Back at that time, when she was only 3 years old, my cousin had an imaginary friend she called Bobby. Like plenty of young children go through, she would spend long stretches of time playing and talking with Bobby, treating him as though he were every bit as real and present as anyone else in the household. Beyond the ordinary imaginative play, though, she also insisted on some particularly specific, unusual details, demanding that Bobby have his own place properly set at the dinner table during meals, and even requesting that a cushion be placed on the floor right beside her own seat so that Bobby could sit comfortably and watch television alongside her each evening. There were other small, specific habits, too. Details my aunt has mentioned over the years whenever retelling this story, things that at the time seemed like nothing more than an unusually vivid imagination at work. My cousin would sometimes pause mid-conversation with an adult to explain that Bobby had just said something funny, or would insist on leaving a small gap on the sofa cushion specifically reserved for him whenever the family sat down together. None of it, taken individually, seemed particularly alarming. Plenty of children develop elaborate, detailed imaginary companions, complete with their own personalities, preferences, and daily routines woven into the family's actual schedule. It was the sheer consistency and specificity of it all, though, day after day, without any real variation, that eventually started to wear on my aunt's nerves more than she initially wanted to admit even to herself. My aunt, understandably, grew increasingly uneasy about the whole situation as the days went on, watching her young daughter's attachment to this imaginary companion grow more elaborate and specific by the week. Still, she went along with it for roughly a week or so, mostly out of a desire not to unnecessarily upset her daughter over what seemed, on the surface at least, like fairly typical childhood behavior. Eventually, seeking some reassurance, my aunt consulted a few child-rearing books from her local library, which confirmed that having an imaginary friend, even one as detailed and persistent as Bobby, was a completely normal developmental phase that many young children go through. Comforted by that explanation, my aunt largely stopped worrying about it, allowing her daughter to continue her imaginative play with Bobby without any further concern. A few months later, during the winter of that same year, my uncle had recently started a new job that required him to work rotating shifts, including occasional overnight hours. On one particular evening, he happened to be scheduled for a night shift, leaving my aunt and my young cousin alone together in the house for the entire evening. As the night wore on, it eventually came time for my cousin's usual bedtime routine, so my aunt took her upstairs to get her ready for bed the same way she did every single night. As had become completely routine by that point, my cousin asked my aunt whether Bobby also needed to go to bed, and my aunt, as she always did, simply played along, confirming that yes, Bobby would be going to bed as well that night. After helping my cousin change into her pajamas, the two of them headed into her bedroom together, where my aunt read a bedtime story to both my cousin and, by extension, Bobby, tucked them both into bed, and gave her daughter a goodnight kiss before finally finishing up her evening parenting duties and preparing to head back downstairs to relax for a while before turning in herself. My aunt left my cousin's bedroom and made her way back down the stairs, intending to make herself a cup of tea and settle in to watch some television before bed. Just as she reached the bottom of the staircase, though, my cousin called out from upstairs, pointing out that my aunt had apparently forgotten to switch off the bedroom light. Since she normally slept with her door left open and the hallway light kept on rather than her bedroom light itself remaining lit throughout the night. My aunt has described that specific moment many times over the years, always emphasizing how completely ordinary and unremarkable it felt in the instant it happened. She'd simply forgotten a small step in the nightly routine, the kind of minor oversight any tired parent makes at the end of a long day. And her daughter, alert as ever to the smallest details of her bedtime ritual, had simply called out to correct it exactly the way she often did about various small things. There was nothing in that moment to suggest anything was about to go wrong. Letting out a small, tired sigh, my aunt turned back around and started making her way back up the stairs to correct the oversight. Just as she reached the very top step, though, she watched the light inside my cousin's bedroom suddenly switch off entirely on its own. Almost immediately afterward, my cousin called out cheerfully from inside the room, reassuring her mother that everything was fine, explaining simply that Bobby had turned the light off himself. My aunt has always described that specific moment, watching the light switch off from her vantage point at the top of the stairs, as feeling almost like time itself briefly stopped moving normally. She said the light didn't flicker or dim gradually the way a faulty bulb might. It simply went from fully lit to completely dark in a single instantaneous moment, exactly the way it would if someone had deliberately flipped the switch by hand, quick and decisive, with no hesitation or fading in between. My aunt rushed into the bedroom within seconds of hearing that explanation, finding my cousin still completely tucked into bed exactly where she'd left her only minutes earlier, clearly not having moved from that spot at all. The light switch in that particular bedroom, at that specific point in time, was positioned far too high up on the wall for a 3-year-old to possibly reach on her own. And it was located on the completely opposite side of the room from where my cousin's bed sat next to the door. Standing frozen in the doorway for several long seconds, my aunt genuinely had no idea what had just happened, or what she should possibly do next in response to it, her mind racing through every possible mundane explanation and finding none of them remotely satisfying given exactly what she'd just witnessed with her own eyes. Doing her best to remain outwardly composed despite the mounting panic she was privately experiencing, My aunt decided the safest course of action was simply to behave as normally as possible under the circumstances. She said goodnight to my cousin once more, exactly the same way she would on any ordinary evening, before quickly heading back downstairs and immediately calling my uncle at work. According to what my uncle later described, she sounded so genuinely terrified over the phone that he immediately asked his supervisor for permission to leave work early, citing a family emergency at home that needed his immediate attention. My uncle has mentioned, whenever this story comes up, that he initially assumed something physical must have happened. An accident, an injury, something concrete and immediate that would explain the sheer panic in his wife's voice over the phone. It wasn't until he actually got home and heard the full story directly from her that he understood exactly what had frightened her so deeply. And even then, by his own admission, it took him a while to fully process the specific, impossible detail of that light switching off from across the room. My aunt has told me, more than once over the years, that during those long, agonizing minutes while she waited for my uncle to make his way home, she felt so completely overwhelmed by fear that she genuinely didn't believe she would have been physically capable of going back upstairs to that bedroom again, even if the house itself had somehow caught fire in the meantime. That's how deeply and completely that single, brief moment had shaken her. She's described sitting downstairs during that stretch of waiting, unable to focus on anything at all, the television left off entirely despite her original plan to unwind with it, her tea going cold and untouched on the counter, her attention locked entirely on the staircase, leading up toward her daughter's room. Half expecting, though she couldn't fully explain why, that something further might happen before her husband finally arrived home, every small creak of the house settling around her sounding, in that particular state of heightened fear, far louder and more significant than it ever normally would. The following morning, once my uncle was safely home and the immediate crisis of that terrifying night had passed, my aunt sat down with my cousin for a serious conversation about Bobby. That conversation ultimately concluded with my aunt telling her young daughter, as gently but firmly as she could manage, that she shouldn't continue playing with Bobby anymore going forward. My cousin responded by explaining that Bobby was upset about being asked to leave and that he wanted to stay with her regardless. My aunt, her patience and composure finally cracking under the weight of everything that had happened the previous night, lost her temper somewhat, insisting firmly that Bobby needed to leave and that the matter was completely settled, with no further room for discussion. My uncle has said, whenever this part of the story comes up, that he remembers sitting nearby during that particular conversation, watching his wife try to balance calm, measured parenting against the very real, lingering fear still sitting heavily in her chest from the night before. He's described it as one of the stranger parenting moments either of them ever navigated together, trying to gently discourage a young child's imaginary friend while both privately terrified about what that imaginary friend might actually represent. A few days passed following that particular conversation, during which my cousin never once mentioned or spoke about Bobby again. A silence that itself felt notably different from her previous constant chatter about her imaginary companion. Eventually, my aunt, feeling somewhat more at ease after those few quiet days, casually asked my cousin over lunch what had ultimately happened to Bobby, expecting perhaps some simple, innocent childhood explanation about him moving away or simply not being needed anymore. Instead, my cousin looked directly up at her mother and responded with a single question that sent a genuine chill through my aunt's entire body. "What is a bitch, Mummy?" My aunt has described that exact moment so vividly and consistently every time she's retold this story that I feel like I can almost picture it myself, despite never having witnessed it firsthand. She said the words came out of my cousin so casually, so completely, without any awareness of how loaded or strange the question actually was, that for a brief second, my aunt genuinely wasn't sure she'd heard her daughter correctly at all. Startled and immediately concerned, my aunt asked her daughter where on earth she had picked up such language, firmly telling her that it wasn't an appropriate word for a young child to use. My cousin, completely unfazed and matter-of-fact in her response, simply explained that it was what Bobby himself had said as he was leaving, telling her directly that he was leaving specifically because of the bitch. My aunt has said that in that exact moment, sitting across the lunch table from her 3-year-old daughter, she felt an overwhelming urge to ask further questions, to press for more detail about exactly what Bobby had meant, who or what he might have been referring to, but something about the calm, settled way my cousin delivered that explanation made her decide, almost instinctively, not to push any further. She simply told her daughter again not to repeat that particular word and quietly steered the conversation toward something else entirely, though she's admitted the unease from that exchange stayed with her for the rest of that entire day, and honestly for a long while afterward as well. My aunt has never fully recovered from the chill that particular exchange gave her, even all these years later. There was no possible explanation for where a 3-year-old could have picked up that specific word on her own, especially framed within that exact context, referencing some unnamed hostile figure that had apparently driven Bobby away from the house entirely. My aunt certainly hadn't used that word around her daughter, and as far as anyone in the family has ever been able to determine, there was no other source, television program, visiting relative, or otherwise, that could reasonably account for my young cousin encountering and repeating that specific term in that specific way. I've heard this particular story recounted many times over the years at various family gatherings, and it never fails to leave everyone present with the same lingering unease, regardless of how many times we've already heard it before. My aunt herself still visibly tenses up slightly whenever the story comes up in conversation, even decades removed from the actual events themselves. The memory of that light switching off entirely on its own clearly still as vivid and unsettling to her now as it apparently was on that original winter night. Her voice always dropping slightly at that particular part of the retelling, as though some small part of her still half expects to hear a response from somewhere else in the room. What has always struck me most about this particular story, even more than the light switching off inexplicably, is that final, chilling exchange over lunch a few days later. If the entire incident had simply ended with that one strange night involving the bedroom light, it would already stand as a fairly unsettling family story on its own. But that additional detail, my young cousin calmly repeating a specific adult word she had no reasonable way of having learned elsewhere, directly tied to whatever unseen presence had apparently been sharing her bedroom and her imagination for those preceding months, takes the entire story into a genuinely unsettling place that never fails to give me chills myself, even hearing it secondhand as I have my entire life, retold at every family gathering where the subject of old childhood stories inevitably comes up. My cousin herself, now an adult with children of her own, has absolutely no memory of Bobby at all. Unsurprising, given how young she was at the time everything happened. She's heard the story recounted by my aunt just as many times as the rest of us over the years, though she's always maintained that she experiences it purely as an outside observer, hearing about her own toddler years secondhand, with no personal recollection whatsoever of Bobby, the bedroom light, or that particular unsettling conversation over lunch that finally brought the whole situation to its conclusion. She's mentioned, half joking, half genuinely curious, that she sometimes wonders how differently she might feel about the whole story if she actually remembered any of it firsthand. rather than simply inheriting it secondhand, the same way the rest of us in the family have. A story she now tells her own children as nothing more than a strange, unexplained family legend from long before they were ever born. My aunt has speculated over the years about various possible explanations for what actually happened during that entire period, ranging from some kind of genuine paranormal presence that had attached itself specifically to my young cousin, to more mundane possibilities like faulty household wiring that happened to coincide purely by unlikely chance with exactly the wrong moment to create such an unsettling impression. She's never fully settled on any single explanation that satisfies her completely, and I don't think, after all these years, she ever expects to, having long since made a kind of uneasy peace with simply not knowing for certain what actually happened in that bedroom on that particular winter night. What remains consistent, though, every single time this story gets told within our family, is that specific, unshakable image of my aunt standing frozen at the top of those stairs, watching a light switch off on its own from across a room, followed immediately by her 3-year-old daughter's calm, cheerful reassurance that Bobby had simply taken care of it himself. That image alone, regardless of whatever explanation any of us personally lean toward believing, has never once failed to give every single person in our family at least a small, lingering chill whenever the story gets retold, generation after generation, at family gatherings that continue to bring up that same winter evening from almost 30 years ago, usually late at night, usually once the younger children in the family have already been sent off to bed themselves, as though even now, decades later, we're all still a little cautious about who else might be listening in whenever Bobby's name comes up again. About 5 years ago, something happened that left me absolutely convinced I had genuinely encountered an alien in real life. I was 12 years old at the time, and my family, including my parents and my brother, had just recently relocated from the United States to Querétaro, Mexico. Since we did not yet have our own place to live at that point, my grandmother generously allowed all of us to stay with her for a couple of years while we got settled and eventually found a permanent home of our own. My grandmother's house happened to be located in a fairly rough, somewhat dangerous neighborhood, which meant my mother made the decision to park our family car in a separate, guarded parking lot located about 2 blocks away from the actual house itself, rather than leaving it parked directly outside where it might be more vulnerable. Because of this arrangement, every single morning, the two of us would walk those same 2 blocks together at 5 in the morning, making our way to retrieve the car from that guarded lot before heading off toward school for the day. One particular morning, we were walking our usual route toward the parking lot when, without warning, my mother suddenly stopped walking and told me to be completely quiet. Confused and a little startled by her sudden reaction, I asked her what exactly was going on. She responded by pointing directly toward a tree situated somewhere between 8 and 10 meters away from where we were currently standing. I looked in the exact direction she was pointing, and that is when I first saw it. A small, pointy-eared figure kept popping its head out from behind that tree, almost playfully, in a manner that initially reminded me of a young child teasing us from a hiding spot. But as I continued watching more closely, it became immediately clear that whatever this figure actually was, it was absolutely not a small child. It was a small, gray-skinned creature with large, distinctly oversized eyes, simply staring directly at the two of us from its position near that tree. My mother quickly grabbed hold of my hand and began walking briskly in a completely different direction, clearly wanting to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever we had just witnessed. As we moved away, I glanced back briefly and saw the creature turn and run off rapidly in the opposite direction, disappearing from view almost immediately afterward. About 3 years after this experience originally happened, I found myself doing some unrelated research online when I happened to come across information regarding a documented historical event known as the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter. Reading through the specific details and descriptions associated with that particular case, I became genuinely convinced that whatever my mother and I had personally witnessed that early morning was either the exact same type of being, or at the very least, some closely related species matching many of the same specific physical characteristics described in that separate, well-documented historical account. I want to make clear that I can say, with complete honesty and certainty, that everything I have described here genuinely happened exactly the way I have recounted it. This was not some vague, half-remembered childhood dream or a story exaggerated over time through repeated retelling. Both my mother and I witnessed this creature together, clearly and directly, at the exact same moment, standing side by side on that same quiet street in the early morning darkness. Looking back on this experience now, several specific details continue to stand out to me as particularly significant and difficult to fully explain away using any conventional, rational reasoning. The specific timing of the encounter, occurring during those early morning hours around 5 in the morning, while the surrounding neighborhood remained mostly dark and quiet, created exactly the kind of environment where visibility would have been limited enough to potentially misidentify an ordinary animal or person under less ideal circumstances. And yet, both my mother and I clearly and independently recognized immediately that whatever we were looking at did not match any ordinary explanation available to us in that moment. The creature's specific physical characteristics remain the most striking and unforgettable aspect of the entire encounter. Its noticeably pointed ears, combined with its distinctly gray-colored skin and unusually large, prominent eyes, do not correspond with any common animal native to that specific region of Mexico. Its playful, almost teasing behavior, repeatedly popping its head out from behind that same tree, initially created a brief, misleading impression that we might simply be looking at a mischievous child hiding nearby, which only made the moment we both fully registered its true, distinctly non-human appearance all the more unsettling and immediate. My mother's reaction throughout the entire encounter also remains significant whenever I think back on this experience. She recognized immediately, before I had even fully processed what I was looking at myself, that something was seriously wrong with the situation, urgently telling me to stay quiet and quickly moving us both away from the area entirely. That kind of immediate, instinctive, protective reaction suggests she herself understood clearly, in that same instant, that we were not simply looking at an ordinary animal or a neighborhood child playing some kind of harmless game near that tree. The creature's own reaction upon being noticed adds yet another layer of unsettling detail to the entire memory. Rather than remaining still or continuing its playful, teasing behavior, once it became clear we had spotted it directly, it immediately turned and fled rapidly in the opposite direction, suggesting a level of awareness and deliberate avoidance that further reinforces just how unusual and non-standard this entire encounter genuinely was. Discovering the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter several years later added an entirely new dimension of validation to my own personal experience. Learning that other individuals, entirely unconnected to my own family and separated by both significant time and distance, had previously documented remarkably similar encounters involving creatures matching many of the same specific physical characteristics I personally witnessed that early morning, helped reinforce my own confidence that what my mother and I had experienced together was genuinely real, rather than some kind of isolated misperception or shared imagination between the two of us. I have thought many times over the years since this happened about how differently that entire morning might have unfolded had my mother not been walking directly beside me at that exact moment. Having a second witness present, someone whose reaction and immediate recognition of the situation so closely matched my own, has remained an important source of validation whenever I have shared this story with others over the years, particularly given how frequently these kinds of personal encounters tend to be dismissed or doubted by people who were not actually present to witness them directly themselves. Even now, so many years removed from that early morning walk toward the parking lot, I still find myself thinking back on that specific image whenever the topic of extraterrestrial encounters comes up in conversation. That small, gray, pointy-eared figure repeatedly peeking out from behind a tree before ultimately fleeing the moment it realized it had been fully seen. Whatever it actually was that my mother and I encountered together that morning, I remain completely convinced, even now, that it was something genuinely unexplainable. Something entirely outside the realm of any ordinary, conventional explanation available to either of us in that moment. And something I continue to carry with me clearly in my memory to this very day. My grandparents, for whatever reason, seemed to have this strange, consistent habit of always ending up moving into homes that turned out to be haunted in some way. None of these houses were ever particularly creepy or unsettling on the surface, at least not visually. They generally looked like completely ordinary, unremarkable homes from the outside. But almost without exception, strange, unexplainable paranormal occurrences would eventually start happening within them, no matter which specific house they happened to be living in at the time. To keep things relatively brief for now, I will focus specifically on my own personal experience, though I am more than happy to share additional stories if anyone happens to be curious about hearing more. This particular experience took place during a summer vacation, back when I was around 13 or 14 years old. At that specific age, I had developed the fairly typical teenage habit of staying up late into the night, snacking on junk food and playing video games well past when the rest of the household had already gone to bed. Because of this habit, I became extremely familiar with the specific sounds and vibrations produced whenever someone walked down the hallway outside my bedroom. My own bedroom was positioned at the very end of that hallway, directly across from my grandparents' bedroom. This meant that whenever I heard someone walking down that hallway late at night, it was almost always my grandfather, typically getting up to grab some antacid medication from the hallway cupboard. Over time, I became so familiar with this specific nightly routine that I could easily recognize the distinct, repeating pattern involved. The soft sound of his feet moving steadily across the carpet as he made his way down the hallway toward that cupboard, followed by a brief pause, and then that same steady sound of footsteps making their way back toward his bedroom. The entire routine would typically end with the clear, familiar sound of his bedroom door closing gently behind him as he settled back into bed. That was the pattern I grew accustomed to, night after night. But eventually, I started noticing something different. At random points throughout various nights, I would hear that same familiar sound of footsteps moving down the hallway. If this happened any later than around 1 in the morning, I would sometimes get curious enough to actually open my own bedroom door to check, and every single time there would be absolutely nobody there in the hallway. Trying to stay rational about the whole thing, I initially assumed my grandfather must simply have been moving quickly enough to already be back inside his own bedroom before I actually managed to open my door and look. So, the next time I heard those same footsteps, I made a point of waiting specifically until the sound reached the far end of the hallway, right around where that same cupboard containing the antacids was located, before finally opening my door to check. Still nothing. Just complete darkness, silent and undisturbed. Over time, I gradually grew more accustomed to these unexplained footsteps, since they were never particularly loud or aggressive sounding. Just an ordinary, familiar sound of feet moving across carpet. Eventually, I started assuming that I was probably just imagining or misinterpreting the sounds at least half of the time, gradually becoming less concerned about investigating every single occurrence. Then, one particular night, I found myself lying in bed, casually watching television as I usually did before eventually falling asleep. The head of my bed happened to share the same wall as my bedroom door. On this specific night, I once again heard those same familiar footsteps beginning their usual journey down the hallway. By this point, I barely reacted at all, already fully accustomed to simply ignoring the sound whenever it occurred. The footsteps continued steadily making their way down the hallway, eventually approaching my specific end of the hall. Still, I remained relaxed, assuming it was simply my grandfather again, or perhaps, as I had increasingly begun to suspect, whatever unexplained presence seemed to occasionally produce that same familiar sound throughout the house. But then, the footsteps suddenly stopped directly outside my bedroom door. Immediately afterward, my doorknob began making an intense, rapid clacking sound, exactly as though someone were aggressively and repeatedly attempting to turn the doorknob back and forth, without ever actually managing to fully open the door itself. I immediately jumped out of bed and rushed straight toward my door, fully intending to catch whoever, or whatever, was responsible for that sudden aggressive rattling. My first genuine assumption, even in that tense moment, was that my grandfather, who admittedly had something of a mischievous streak, might simply be messing with me as some kind of prank. I threw open my door as quickly as I possibly could, ready to catch him in the act. There was nothing there. The hallway remained completely dark, exactly as dark and undisturbed as it had been every single other time I had checked previously. Everything was silent, with absolutely no indication that anyone had been standing there only seconds earlier. I walked quietly over to my grandparents' bedroom door and carefully, slowly opened it just enough to peek inside. I was met immediately with the sound of my grandfather's familiar, steady snoring, confirming clearly that he had been sound asleep in his own bed the entire time, nowhere near my own bedroom door at all. Reflecting back on this entire experience now, several specific details continue to stand out to me as particularly unsettling and difficult to fully explain away using any conventional, rational reasoning. The consistency of those unexplained footsteps over such an extended period of time remains especially significant, given how frequently I heard them repeat that exact same pattern, night after night, always following that same familiar route down the hallway and back, closely mimicking my grandfather's own regular nightly routine, yet occurring on nights when he himself was demonstrably not the one responsible for producing them. The specific detail of that final, aggressive doorknob rattling remains, without question, the single most unsettling moment from this entire experience. Up until that particular night, the unexplained footsteps themselves had always felt relatively harmless, easy enough to grow accustomed to and eventually mostly ignore. But that sudden shift from simple footsteps passing by to something actively, aggressively attempting to force its way directly into my own bedroom introduced an entirely new, more immediate level of fear into the situation. One that I had not previously experienced throughout all those earlier occurrences. I have also thought many times since that specific night about the sheer speed and completeness with which everything went silent the moment I actually opened my door. If my grandfather genuinely had been playing some kind of prank on me, attempting to quickly retreat back to his own bedroom before I managed to catch him in the act, it seems unlikely he could have covered that entire distance. opened his own bedroom door quietly enough not to wake himself further, and settled back into a deep enough sleep to produce that same steady, convincing snoring sound. All within the incredibly short window of time between when that aggressive doorknob rattling stopped and when I actually managed to open my own door to check. Given how many additional strange experiences apparently occurred throughout my grandparents' various homes over the years, this particular incident represents just one small piece of a much larger ongoing pattern that seemed to consistently follow them from house to house, regardless of the specific property or neighborhood they happened to be living in at any given time. That consistent pattern, spanning multiple different homes over an extended period, makes it considerably more difficult to simply write off any single individual incident, including my own experience with those unexplained footsteps and that aggressively rattling doorknob, as pure coincidence or isolated imagination. Even now, whenever I think back on that particular summer, staying up late playing video games and eating junk food long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep, I find myself remembering that same distinct, familiar sound of footsteps moving steadily down that hallway carpet, and that unmistakable, aggressive clacking of my own doorknob being violently rattled by something or someone. That vanished so completely and so quickly that no trace of it remained by the time I actually managed to open my door and look. To this day, I still do not have any clear, satisfying explanation for exactly what was happening in that house during those specific summer nights, but I can say with complete certainty that whatever it was not simply my imagination, and it was definitely not my grandfather either. Looking back now, I think part of what made those early weeks so disorienting was how ordinary everything else about my life was at the time. I was just a normal 15-year-old, going to school, hanging out with friends, dealing with the usual small dramas that come with being that age. And layered on top of all of that completely ordinary teenage existence was this strange, persistent presence that nobody else seemed able to confirm at first. It created this bizarre split in my daily experience, moving through school hallways and friend group conversations as though everything were completely normal, while simultaneously carrying this growing, private terror that something was deeply wrong, something I couldn't get anyone else to acknowledge or take seriously. When I was 15 years old, I found myself being followed everywhere I went by two different men, each driving his own gold Dodge Intrepid, though the specific models differed slightly between the two vehicles. One of the men appeared to be in his early 30s, with dark hair and a mustache, while the other was considerably older, somewhere in his 60s, with a full head of white hair. I never actually saw either of them standing up at any point during the entire time this happened, only ever glimpsing them seated behind the wheel of their respective cars. So I have no real way of knowing anything about their height or build beyond what I could observe of their faces and general appearance while they sat there watching me. For roughly the first month after I first started noticing them, I genuinely believed I was losing my mind. Nobody else around me had seen either man firsthand, and without any outside confirmation. I began seriously questioning my own grip on reality, wondering if I was simply imagining the whole thing out of some kind of paranoid delusion. That isolating uncertainty, more than the actual presence of the men themselves, was one of the hardest parts of those early weeks. Constantly doubting my own perception of what was clearly, repeatedly happening right in front of me. That changed one day when I was out walking with my boyfriend, and the older man in his car began slowly circling the block we were walking through. I pointed him out immediately, and the two of us started keeping a running count of exactly how many times his car passed us as he continued circling and doubling back along the same short stretch of road. By the time that same car, driven by that same man, had passed us a full 15 times within an area spanning only about 6 blocks, my boyfriend finally had no choice but to believe me completely. It was undeniably strange and unsettling, though at that particular point, it still felt more creepy than genuinely terrifying. A persistent, uncomfortable presence, rather than an outright threat. Throughout this entire ordeal, neither man ever came directly to my house, never spoke to me in person, and never made any direct attempt to approach me, at least not during those early months. Still, I couldn't leave my own home for any reason without one or the other of them appearing somewhere along my route, following at a distance in that same gold car, always present, always watching, regardless of where I was actually going or what I was doing. What made the whole situation even harder to dismiss as some kind of personal delusion was just how many other people eventually saw these men themselves, completely independent of my own observations. My mom saw them. My adopted mom saw them as well. My brother noticed them repeatedly. My boyfriend, obviously, had already confirmed what I'd been telling him. Most of my close friends eventually caught sight of one or both men trailing us at various points. Even the local police, once we finally involved them, personally witnessed the men following me on at least a few separate occasions. Despite all of that confirmed, corroborated observation from so many different, credible sources, nobody, including the police themselves, seemed to have any real explanation for who these men actually were or what they wanted from me. I remember how strange it felt, in a way, once other people finally started confirming what I'd been experiencing alone for that first month. There was a small measure of relief in no longer feeling like I was losing my grip on reality, but that relief came paired with an entirely new, equally unsettling realization that this wasn't something I could simply explain away as my own imagination running wild. It was real. It was happening consistently, and multiple credible witnesses, including trained police officers, had now personally seen it with their own eyes, and none of them had any better explanation for it than I did. Then came one particular night, deep in the middle of winter, when everything shifted into something far more frightening than it had ever been up to that point. I'd had an argument with my mom that evening, the kind of heated emotional fight that leaves you needing to physically get away and clear your head for a while. Without really thinking through the consequences, I stormed out of the house at 1 a.m, intending simply to walk for a while until I calmed down enough to go back inside. I made it roughly 3 blocks away from my house before I saw him, the dark-haired man, sitting in his car exactly where I would eventually cross his path. That was the moment real fear finally set in, far more intense than anything I had felt throughout the entire preceding months. It was the middle of the night. There wasn't another single person anywhere on the road besides the two of us. I didn't have a cell phone with me, and I had absolutely no kind of weapon or means of defending myself if things escalated any further. It was just me, alone in the freezing winter darkness, and this man who had been silently tracking my every movement for months already. Fortunately, I knew that particular neighborhood intimately. Every shortcut, every alley, every gap between houses that I'd grown up navigating my entire life. I immediately turned and started running back toward home, weaving deliberately between houses and cutting through narrow back alleys, trying desperately to use my familiarity with the area to put distance between myself and that car. But no matter which direction I chose, no matter how many shortcuts I attempted, every single time I emerged back out into the open from between those houses or alleyways, his car was already there, waiting, somehow consistently managing to get ahead of me, despite my efforts to lose him through unpredictable turns and shortcuts he had no obvious way of anticipating. I remember the specific, bone-deep cold of that night. The kind of cold that stings your lungs with every ragged breath while you're running, mixing with the pure adrenaline-driven panic coursing through me as I sprinted between houses. Every time I paused, even briefly, to catch my breath and reassess which direction to try next, some part of my brain was screaming at me to keep moving, convinced that any moment of hesitation would be the moment he finally caught up to me completely. I remember specific alleys, specific fences I climbed over, specific shortcuts through neighbors' backyards that I'd never normally use, all chosen in that frantic adrenaline-fueled state purely because they felt slightly less predictable than my usual route home. And every single time, without fail, his car was somehow already positioned exactly where I emerged, calm and waiting, as though he'd known precisely which direction I would choose before I even made the decision myself. By the time I finally made it back home that night, something inside me had fundamentally broken. This entire situation had been going on for almost a full year by that point. Every single movement I made outside my own house had been silently monitored. Every trip to a store, every walk with friends, every ordinary errand, all of it watched closely by two men I had never actually met and knew absolutely nothing about beyond their appearance and the cars they drove. Standing there in my house after that terrifying chase through the snow and darkness, I made a decision right then that would end up completely changing how I responded to the situation going forward. If these men intended eventually to kill me or assault me, I decided I would rather force that confrontation to happen immediately, on my own terms, rather than continue living indefinitely under that same constant, silent surveillance. The very next day, the older man was following me again, just as he always did. This time, though, he pulled his car directly up alongside me at an intersection, stopped completely, and simply sat there, smiling calmly at me through the window. Something inside me finally snapped completely in that moment. I threw myself directly at his car, trying with everything I had to drive my elbow through the driver's side window, months of pent-up fear and helpless anger finally exploding out, all at once. He responded by laughing, giving me a casual wave, and calmly driving away, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the street, screaming after him at the top of my lungs, telling him that if he wanted me, he could come and get me right then and there, that I was done being afraid and done running. I don't think, before that particular morning, I had ever felt anger and fear combine into something quite so overwhelming and physical. It wasn't a calculated decision in any real sense, more an involuntary eruption of everything I'd been quietly carrying for nearly a full year, all of it finally breaking loose in that single desperate act of throwing myself at his car. I remember the cold surface of the door under my hands, the useless, stinging impact of my elbow against glass that refused to give way, and the strange, hollow feeling afterward, standing alone in the middle of an empty street, my own voice still echoing in my ears from screaming after a car that was already disappearing around the corner. Looking back, it's a genuinely reckless thing to have done, throwing myself physically at a stranger's vehicle with absolutely no idea how he might react. But at that specific moment, exhausted and terrified beyond reasonable thought after everything that had built up to it, I simply didn't care anymore what might happen next. After that particular outburst, something did shift in how the two of them behaved going forward. They continued following me, but noticeably gave me more physical space than they had before, no longer trailing quite as closely as they once had. They only ever attempted direct contact with me one single time after that, the following spring, when the older man pulled up beside me and simply asked if I would like a ride somewhere. I declined immediately, and after that particular exchange, their presence gradually seemed to taper off entirely, becoming less and less frequent until, eventually, I stopped seeing either of their cars altogether. I remember that spring encounter almost as vividly as the winter chase, the casual, almost friendly tone in his voice as he asked the question, as though he were simply offering a neighbor a lift on an ordinary afternoon rather than someone who had spent the better part of a year silently tracking my every movement. I declined as calmly and firmly as I could manage, my heart pounding the entire time, despite trying to project outward confidence. And he simply nodded, unbothered, and drove off without any further comment. It was the closest either of them ever came to actually speaking with me directly throughout the entire 15 months, and even now I still replay that brief, unsettling exchange in my mind more often than almost any other single moment from that whole ordeal. Even now, so many years removed from that entire experience, I still remember every specific detail with startling clarity. The younger man drove a gold 1999 Dodge Intrepid, and the older man drove a gold Intrepid from around the same general era, close enough in appearance that at a glance the two cars could easily be mistaken for one another. I still clearly remember the exact Michigan license plate on the older man's car, reading NJA 328. A string of letters and numbers that has stayed lodged in my memory just as firmly as the men's faces themselves, even all these years later, far longer than I've ever managed to forget the sound of my own screaming voice echoing down that empty street. In total, the two of them followed me for roughly 15 consistent months, making direct personal contact with me only that single time when he offered me a ride. To this day, I genuinely have no idea who either of those men actually were, what their specific intentions toward me might have been, or why they eventually chose to stop. Questions that have followed me quietly into adulthood without ever finding a satisfying answer. 12 years have passed since all of this originally happened, and I can honestly say that some part of me remains quietly worried, even now, that they might eventually resurface again someday. That fear has never fully gone away, even with so much time having passed without any further sign of either man or either car reappearing anywhere near me since. And I doubt, if I'm being completely honest with myself, that it ever fully will. Looking back on that entire experience now as an adult, what strikes me most isn't necessarily any single specific incident, frightening as several of them undeniably were, but rather the sheer, sustained duration of it all. 15 months is an incredibly long stretch of time to live under that kind of constant, silent observation, never fully certain from one day to the next whether today might finally be the day something worse happened, yet also never having any concrete answers about who these men were or what exactly they wanted from me in the first place. A stretch of time that, looking back now, feels almost impossible to have survived without it leaving some permanent mark behind. That combination, constant vigilance paired with total uncertainty, wore on me in ways I don't think I fully appreciated at the time. Too young and too overwhelmed in the moment to properly process just how exhausting and psychologically damaging that entire ordeal genuinely was. A weight I only really came to understand fully once I was old enough to look back on it with some measure of adult perspective. I've thought many times over the years about reporting everything more formally, wondering whether there was ever any kind of official record made connecting those specific license plates to any documented pattern of behavior. Whether other people in different towns or neighborhoods might have experienced something similarly unsettling involving the same two men and the same two cars. I've never had any success finding additional information along those lines, and at this point, I suspect I never fully will. Whatever official reports were filed with the police at the time have likely long since been closed or forgotten, filed away as an unresolved oddity rather than anything that warranted continued investigation once the two men eventually stopped appearing. I remember specifically sitting down with an officer at one point during that year, describing everything in as much detail as I could manage, giving him the license plate number, the make and model of both cars, physical descriptions of both men, and a rough timeline of how frequently they'd been appearing. He took notes diligently enough, and even personally witnessed the older man's car following me on at least one occasion himself. Yet even with all of that, nothing concrete ever seemed to come from it. No arrest, no formal warning issued, no explanation ever provided to either me or my family about what, if anything, the department had actually managed to uncover about who these men were or why they had been doing what they were doing. What I've come to accept over the 12 years since all of this happened is that I will probably never get any real answers about who those two men actually were or what their true intentions toward me had been. I've had to make peace, as much as anyone reasonably can, with an entire chapter of my adolescence remaining permanently unresolved. A persistent, unanswered mystery that occasionally still surfaces in my mind unexpectedly, triggered by the sight of an old gold sedan passing by on the street, or sometimes for no discernible reason at all. Whatever their reasons truly were, whatever they had been planning or hoping to eventually do, I still carry a quiet, persistent wariness with me even now, more than a decade removed from that final spring when their presence finally faded away completely. Never fully certain whether that particular chapter of my life is genuinely closed for good or simply paused, waiting somewhere out there to eventually begin again, watching from somewhere I can no longer see. The same way they once did from the driver's seat of two ordinary-looking gold cars parked patiently along an otherwise unremarkable street. Even now, I still occasionally find myself glancing twice at any older gold sedan I happen to pass on the road, my heart briefly quickening before I remind myself every single time that it's almost certainly nothing. Just an ordinary car driven by an ordinary stranger with no connection at all to what happened to me all those years ago. But that brief flicker of recognition, that instinctive tightening in my chest, has never fully gone away, no matter how much time continues to pass. And I suspect, honestly, that it never fully will. Looking back on it now, years later, that particular time of day, right after school let out, but well before either of my parents would realistically be home, had always felt like a quiet, comfortable stretch of solitude to me. Being an only child meant I'd grown used to entertaining myself during those afternoon hours, and having the house completely to myself for a few hours every day never once struck me as anything worth worrying about beforehand. If anything, I usually looked forward to that stretch of quiet time, a small buffer between the noise of the school day and the eventual return of my parents in the evening, a routine I never once thought to question or worry about until that single afternoon changed everything. This particular story isn't quite as intense as some of the other experiences I've heard from other people, but it's still something that has genuinely stuck with me ever since it happened, so I figured I'd share it anyway. One ordinary day after school, I walked home the way I always did, arriving at my house earlier than usual, sometime around 2 in the afternoon. I should mention that I'm an only child, and both of my parents worked jobs that kept them out of the house until fairly late in the evening, usually not getting home themselves until around 6. That particular afternoon, shortly after getting home, I needed to use the bathroom rather urgently, so I headed straight there without giving it much thought, closing the door behind me the way anyone normally would. While I was in there taking care of business, I suddenly heard a loud, hard knock on the bathroom door, sharp and forceful enough that it genuinely startled me in the moment. Assuming it must be one of my parents, despite the fact that they weren't supposed to be home yet, I immediately called out, asking if it was my mom or my dad standing outside. There was no response at all, just silence following that single hard knock. My first instinct was simply to assume that whoever had knocked, presumably one of my parents arriving home unexpectedly early, must not have heard me answer, and had already walked away from the door without waiting for a response. That explanation felt reasonable enough in the moment that I didn't think too much further about it, finishing up what I was doing in the bathroom before eventually washing up and heading out to see who had actually come home. I remember specifically how ordinary that entire train of thought felt at the time. The kind of small, unremarkable assumption you make dozens of times a day without ever second guessing it. It genuinely never occurred to me in that first moment that anything might actually be wrong. Parents come home early sometimes, knock on doors when they need something, and don't always wait around for a response if they assume you're occupied. It was only in the minutes that followed that this simple, comfortable assumption began to completely unravel. I made my way toward my parents' bedroom first, assuming that's where I would find whichever one of them had arrived home early enough to knock on the bathroom door while I was inside. When I got there, though, the room was completely empty. No sign of either parent. No indication that anyone had actually come home at all. Confused by this, I immediately pulled out my phone and called both of my parents' cell phones, one after the other, hoping to get some kind of explanation for what had just happened. Both of them answered, and both confirmed without any hesitation that they were still at work, exactly where they were supposed to be at that hour. Nowhere near the house at all. Hearing that confirmation from both of them directly is honestly the moment I nearly lost complete control of my own body out of pure fear. I mean that quite literally. The realization that neither of my parents had been anywhere near the house, and yet something had clearly knocked, hard and deliberately, directly on the bathroom door while I was inside, sent a wave of terror through me so intense that I genuinely soiled myself right then and there, standing alone in my parents' empty bedroom. I remember standing there afterward, phone still in my hand, staring at the empty bedroom around me, my mind racing to try to make sense of what had just happened. If it wasn't my mom, and it wasn't my dad, then who or what had knocked on that door so firmly while I was inside? I ran through every possible explanation I could think of in those first frantic seconds. A delivery person who'd somehow gotten confused and wandered further into the house than they should have. Some other family member I hadn't considered who might have had a spare key, even. Briefly. The unsettling possibility that I had simply misheard something else entirely as a knock. None of those explanations felt satisfying, and each one crumbled almost as quickly as I considered it, leaving me standing there in mounting, uncontrollable panic with absolutely no rational answer to hold on to. My heartbeat still hammering loudly enough in my ears that I could barely think clearly at all. As if that revelation alone wasn't unsettling enough, almost immediately after hanging up the phone with my parents, I began hearing something moving around in the kitchen. I couldn't make out any clear, distinct footsteps exactly, but our kitchen floor has always had a particular set of creaky spots that reliably make noise whenever any weight is placed on them. And I could hear those same familiar creaks happening steadily, one after another, as though something or someone were slowly making its way across the kitchen floor. I knew those specific creaky spots intimately, the same way you learn every quirk of a house you've grown up in without ever consciously trying to memorize them. There was a particular board near the refrigerator that always groaned loudly whenever anyone stepped on it, and another near the pantry door that made a slightly higher-pitched creak. What I heard that afternoon followed that exact same pattern, the same sequence of sounds I'd heard countless times before whenever my parents moved around the kitchen preparing dinner or grabbing a snack. Except this time, I knew with absolute certainty that neither of them was actually there to be making those sounds, a fact that made every single creak feel far heavier and more menacing than it ever had before. The instant I heard those creaks, every bit of remaining composure I had completely vanished. I bolted toward my own bedroom as fast as I possibly could, moving faster than I think I ever have before or since, slamming my door shut behind me and locking it immediately, my hands shaking so badly that it took a couple of frantic attempts before the lock actually clicked into place properly. I stayed in there, completely still and silent, refusing to move or make a single sound until my parents finally arrived home later that evening. Those remaining hours alone in my room, waiting for my parents to get home, felt like some of the longest of my entire life. I sat pressed against my bed, phone clutched tightly in my hand, straining to listen for any further sound from beyond my door, my mind cycling endlessly between trying to convince myself it had all been some kind of misunderstanding and fully believing something genuinely dangerous was still somewhere in the house with me. Every small sound the house naturally made, settling walls, distant traffic outside, the hum of the refrigerator, seemed amplified tenfold in that state of heightened fear, each one sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me before I could remind myself it was probably nothing. A cycle that repeated itself over and over for what felt like hours until I finally heard the unmistakable, welcome sound of my parents' car pulling into the driveway. When they got back and I finally told them everything that had happened, we did a full, thorough check of the entire house together, looking specifically for any sign of forced entry, any broken window, any unlocked door that might explain how someone could have gotten inside without permission. We found absolutely nothing out of place. No broken locks, no forced windows, no sign whatsoever that anyone had entered the house through any conventional means. Everything was exactly as it should have been, completely secure and undisturbed, aside from that single hard knock on the bathroom door and the creaking kitchen floor that had sent me running in sheer panic toward my own room. We even checked the garage, the attic access, and every closet on the ground floor just to be absolutely thorough, and every single one of them turned up nothing whatsoever out of the ordinary. To this day, I genuinely have no explanation for what happened that particular afternoon. I've turned it over countless times in my head over the years, trying to come up with some kind of logical, grounded explanation that accounts for everything I experienced. I've considered whether the house itself might simply have some kind of natural settling or creaking pattern that, combined with an overactive, anxious imagination, could have made an entirely empty house feel occupied when it wasn't. I've wondered whether the knock itself might have come from some external source, a tree branch against a window, a sudden gust of wind rattling something loose somewhere in the house, though nothing about the specific, sharp, deliberate quality of that knock has ever felt consistent with such an explanation whenever I really think back on it honestly. I've even gone so far, at various points over the years, as to research whether houses in general sometimes produce sounds convincing enough to be mistaken for a deliberate knock, learning about things like pipes expanding and contracting with temperature changes, or foundations settling in ways that can occasionally produce sharp, sudden noises. None of that research has ever fully satisfied me, though, mostly because the knock itself was only the beginning of that entire sequence of events. Even if I could somehow explain away the knock alone as some ordinary structural sound, it does nothing to account for the very real, very specific creaking footsteps that followed only minutes later, matching so precisely the exact pattern of someone actually walking across that kitchen floor. Footsteps that moved with a steady, deliberate rhythm no random structural settling has ever come close to replicating in that house since. What has always bothered me most about that particular afternoon isn't necessarily the knock itself, frightening as it certainly was in the moment, but rather the eerie, deliberate timing and sequence of everything that followed it. If it had simply been some random settling noise or an odd gust of wind, I doubt it would have coincided so precisely with my own vulnerable moment in the bathroom, immediately followed by an empty house. Confirmed empty parents on the phone, and then those unmistakable, familiar creaks moving steadily across the kitchen floor exactly the way they always do whenever an actual person walks across. I've thought, more than once, about whether it might have simply been some kind of intruder, someone who had somehow gotten into the house without leaving any obvious trace of forced entry, knocking on the bathroom door for reasons I can't begin to guess at, before retreating and moving quietly through the kitchen while I was still inside, gathering myself. That explanation, while more grounded in ordinary physical reality than anything supernatural, honestly doesn't feel much less disturbing than any alternative I've considered. The idea of a stranger having somehow entered our locked, secure house, knocked directly on the door while I was in a uniquely vulnerable position, and then simply wandered calmly through the kitchen, before presumably leaving again without a trace, carries its own particular kind of horror entirely separate from anything supernatural. Perhaps even more unsettling in some ways, since it implies a very real, very human danger, rather than something safely distant and unlikely to repeat itself. Since that day, I've never fully been able to shake a small, persistent unease whenever I find myself home alone, especially during those particular afternoon hours when I know for certain that neither of my parents could possibly be there yet. I find myself listening far more closely than I ever used to for any unusual sound in the house, particularly paying close attention to that same set of creaky kitchen floorboards, half expecting, even years later, to hear that same telltale pattern of sound moving steadily across the kitchen while I'm home completely alone. My ears straining almost automatically now toward that part of the house the second I stepped through the front door by myself. My parents, understandably, were deeply unsettled by the whole story once I explained everything to them that evening, and in the weeks following the incident, we ended up having a security system installed throughout the house. Something none of us had ever felt was particularly necessary before that specific afternoon. Cameras were placed at each entry point, motion sensors were installed covering the main areas of the house, all specifically intended to catch and record anything unusual that might happen again, while either my parents or I were away or otherwise occupied elsewhere in the house. My dad, in particular, took the whole situation extremely seriously, spending an entire weekend personally checking every window latch, every door lock, and every possible point of entry throughout the house, determined to identify some kind of vulnerability that might explain how someone could have gotten inside undetected. He found nothing conclusive, which, in a strange way, only made the whole situation feel more unsettling rather than less, confirming that whatever had happened that afternoon hadn't been the result of some simple, easily fixed security oversight, but something far harder to pin down or guard against with locks and latches alone. Thankfully, in all the years since that particular incident, nothing similar has ever happened again. No further unexplained knocks, no more mysterious creaking footsteps moving through an apparently empty house while I was home alone. It remains, to this day, a single, isolated incident, standing completely apart from everything else that's happened in that house before or since. Both comforting in its uniqueness and deeply unsettling in the complete lack of any explanation for why it happened in the first place. A single, strange afternoon that never repeated itself, yet never once faded from memory either. I've told this story to a handful of close friends over the years, and the reactions have generally fallen into one of two categories: either genuine unease and a series of follow-up questions trying to piece together some rational explanation the same way I've tried to myself, or a more skeptical, slightly dismissive response, suggesting it was probably just an overactive imagination combined with some ordinary, explainable household noise that got misinterpreted in a moment of heightened anxiety. I understand both reactions completely. And honestly, some days I lean more toward believing the skeptical explanation myself, while other days, particularly whenever I happen to be home alone and the house grows unusually quiet, I find that same old unease creeping back in. The memory of that hard, deliberate knock and those unmistakable kitchen floor creaks, refusing to fully fade into something I can comfortably dismiss, no matter how many years continue to pass without anything similar ever happening again. What I keep coming back to, more than any specific theory about what actually happened, is just how completely normal that entire afternoon felt, right up until the exact moment that knock happened. There was nothing unusual about my walk home from school that day. Nothing different about arriving home a little earlier than my parents, the way I did most days. It was, in every sense, an entirely ordinary, unremarkable afternoon, right up until it very suddenly wasn't. And that abrupt, jarring shift from complete normalcy into genuine terror is something that has stuck with me far more vividly than almost any other memory from that particular period of my life. More vividly, even, than plenty of memories from around that same age that should logically have felt far more significant. Even now, years later, whenever I happen to be home alone during those same specific afternoon hours, waiting for my parents to eventually arrive home from work, I find myself instinctively more alert than I probably need to be, listening carefully for any unexpected sound, any unfamiliar creak, any hint that the house might not be as completely empty as it should be. I don't know if I'll ever fully get past that particular lingering unease, and honestly, after everything that happened that one strange afternoon, I'm not entirely sure I want to. It feels, in some strange way, like a small, permanent reminder to stay alert, even in the most familiar and seemingly secure spaces. Because sometimes, for reasons you may never fully understand, the ordinary safety of your own home can be interrupted by something you simply can't explain. I still, to this day, avoid using that particular bathroom whenever I'm home completely alone, opting instead for a different one elsewhere in the house whenever possible. Even though logically I know the decision makes very little practical difference, given that whatever happened that day was never actually tied to the bathroom itself in any specific way. It's simply become one of those small, irrational habits that stuck with me permanently after that single afternoon. A quiet, private ritual of avoidance that I've never quite been able to talk myself out of, no matter how many uneventful years have passed since, and no matter how many times I've reminded myself, standing outside that same bathroom door, that nothing has ever happened there again. Looking back, I think that particular summer represented one of the most emotionally overwhelming stretches of my entire life. Everything seeming to pile up at once in a way that made it genuinely difficult to process any single part of it fully. Losing my father-in-law so suddenly, combined with the abrupt loss of my own job, created a kind of compounding stress that neither my husband nor I had ever really experienced simultaneously before, and looking back, I don't think either of us fully appreciated at the time just how much that combined weight was affecting our day-to-day functioning. Mine especially, given how thoroughly my sleep schedule had fallen apart because of it. A few summers ago, my husband and I went through an incredibly difficult stretch of time. His father had just passed away after suffering a massive heart attack, a loss that hit both of us hard, and right around that same period, I had also been laid off from my job. Between grieving and dealing with the sudden uncertainty of unemployment, my sleep schedule fell apart almost completely. I found myself wide awake at all hours of the night, unable to settle my mind enough to actually rest. So I filled those long, restless nights with whatever quiet activities I could find to occupy myself. Browsing on the computer, cleaning our guns, sharpening our knives. Small, methodical tasks that gave my hands something to do while my mind refused to slow down. On top of everything else going on during that already stressful summer, we'd also been dealing with a strange, persistent problem involving someone repeatedly parking in our driveway for reasons neither of us could ever figure out. Every single time it happened, I would call the local sheriff's department. And every single time, by the time they actually arrived, whoever had been parked there was already long gone, leaving us with no real answers and a growing sense of unease about who exactly kept showing up uninvited on our property. My husband and I live out in a fairly remote, rural area, genuinely out in the middle of nowhere by most standards, so there really shouldn't have been any legitimate reason for a stranger to repeatedly find themselves parked in our driveway of all places. That particular mystery had been going on for a few weeks by that point, occurring somewhat unpredictably, sometimes a few days apart, sometimes closer together, always following the exact same frustrating pattern. I'd noticed the car sitting there, unfamiliar and clearly not belonging to any neighbor or expected visitor, call it in immediately. And by the time any deputy actually made the drive out to our remote property, the car would already be gone, leaving nothing behind to explain who had been there or why. It became a source of near constant low-grade anxiety for both of us, never quite escalating into full-blown panic, but always sitting there in the back of our minds as an unresolved, nagging concern. One particular night, during that same stretch of restless insomnia, I found myself sitting in the middle of our living room floor, dressed in nothing more than a tank top and underwear, which had somehow, without either of us really planning it that way, become something of an unofficial home defense uniform for those long, sleepless nights. I was cleaning our Smith & Wesson 12, nothing particularly dramatic about the task itself, just routine maintenance, general dusting, and light cleaning to keep the gun in good working condition. There was something almost meditative about those late-night cleaning sessions, a way of channeling all that restless, sleepless energy into something productive and methodical, rather than simply lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and stewing over everything that had gone wrong that particular summer. The repetitive, familiar motions of disassembling, cleaning, and reassembling a firearm gave my hands something concrete to focus on, even while my mind continued quietly processing grief and stress in the background. The side window in our living room happened to be open that night, giving me a clear, unobstructed view directly out toward our driveway. I remember glancing out at one point and seeing absolutely nothing unusual. No car parked where it shouldn't be, no person standing anywhere outside. Everything appeared completely normal and undisturbed. Or at least, that's what I thought at the time. Not too long after that, I heard some rustling coming from just outside that same open window. My first instinct was to dismiss it as nothing more than some kind of wildlife, a coyote or a raccoon passing through. The kind of ordinary nighttime noise you get used to fairly quickly living out in such a rural, wooded area. Living where we do, you learn to tune out most small sounds like that without giving them much additional thought, since genuine wildlife activity around the property is honestly a nightly occurrence rather than anything unusual. But then, almost immediately after that initial rustling sound, I saw something that instantly shattered that casual assumption completely. Two human hands appeared at the edge of the window, actively working to pop the screen loose from its frame, clearly attempting to force their way inside our house through that same open window I'd been sitting near only moments earlier. Everything about that moment felt suspended in a strange, slowed-down clarity. the kind of hyper-focused awareness people often describe experiencing during genuinely dangerous situations. I remember registering every small detail of those hands with unusual sharpness, their careful, deliberate movement against the screen, the way they worked methodically at the edges rather than simply tearing at it recklessly, suggesting whoever was on the other side had done something like this before, or at least had thought carefully about how to approach it quietly and efficiently, patient enough to work the screen loose rather than rushing the attempt in one clumsy motion. I genuinely don't know, even now, exactly how I managed to move as quickly as I did in that specific moment. Before I even had time to consciously process what I was seeing, some deep, instinctive part of my brain had already taken over completely. I chambered around in the gun I'd been cleaning only seconds earlier, vaulted directly over our coffee table without any hesitation whatsoever, and had the barrel of that gun pressed firmly against the face of whoever had been trying to break in, all in what felt like a single, uninterrupted motion, faster than I ever could have imagined myself capable of moving under any other circumstances. I remember in the immediate aftermath trying to reconstruct exactly how I'd covered that distance so quickly. The coffee table, the open space of the living room, the window itself, all traversed in what genuinely felt like less time than it takes to consciously form a single, complete thought. A blur of motion I still can't fully piece back together in proper sequence, even now. My husband, woken by the sudden commotion, told me afterward that he'd heard the entire sequence happen so fast that by the time he made it into the living room himself, gun already drawn and aimed, whoever had been at that window was already scrambling backward away from the house as quickly as they possibly could, disappearing into the darkness of our property before either of us could get a clear enough look to identify him. I haven't seen that particular person anywhere near our property since that exact night. Looking back now, so much time removed from that specific summer, what strikes me most is just how quickly instinct completely overrode any conscious, deliberate thought process in that critical moment. I wasn't consciously thinking through each individual step, chambering the round, moving around the furniture, positioning the gun. My body simply did all of it automatically, almost as though some deeply trained protective reflex had been sitting dormant, waiting specifically for a moment like that one to finally activate itself completely. I think part of why I was able to react so decisively and immediately comes down to the specific emotional state I'd been living in throughout that entire difficult summer. Grieving my father-in-law's sudden death, combined with the added stress of losing my own job, had left me in a near constant state of heightened alertness already. My nerves perpetually on edge from everything else going on in our lives during that particular stretch of time. Add to that the persistent, unresolved mystery of someone repeatedly parking in our driveway without any clear explanation, and I think I'd already been unconsciously bracing myself for something like that to eventually happen, even if I never consciously admitted that fear to myself at the time. Grief, I've come to understand since, has a strange way of heightening certain instincts, even while dulling others almost completely. In the weeks following my father-in-law's death, I found myself far more attuned to small sounds and movements around the house than I'd ever been before, jumping at noises I would have previously dismissed without a second thought, while simultaneously feeling numb and disconnected from so many other ordinary aspects of daily life. That particular combination, hyper-alert yet emotionally exhausted, feels, in hindsight, like exactly the strange psychological state that allowed me to react so instinctively and so quickly the moment actual danger finally appeared directly in front of me. A state I've never quite experienced again in the same way since, thankfully. given everything it took to arrive at it in the first place. That earlier pattern with the mystery vehicle in our driveway had already put both my husband and me on edge for weeks leading up to that particular night. Every time it happened, we'd find ourselves discussing it quietly afterward, wondering together whether it was simply some confused stranger repeatedly taking a wrong turn onto our long, isolated driveway, or whether there was something far more deliberate and concerning behind it. Neither of us ever settled on an answer that felt satisfying, and that persistent uncertainty had slowly, steadily worn away at both our senses of security regarding our own home, long before that window incident ever actually happened, leaving us both quietly bracing, without ever fully admitting it out loud, for something eventually escalating beyond just an unexplained car in the driveway. After that night, I found myself thinking constantly about how differently things could have gone if I'd been even a few seconds slower to react. Or if I hadn't happened to be sitting exactly where I was, gun already in hand. At that specific moment, those hands appeared at our window. It's a deeply unsettling thing to sit with, realizing just how much of your own safety in certain moments can come down to pure timing and circumstance, rather than any careful planning or preparation on your part. A realization that has stayed with me long after the initial shock of that night eventually faded into something more manageable. My husband, understandably, was equally shaken once I told him everything that had happened that night. We spent a considerable amount of time afterward discussing additional security measures we might want to consider putting in place. Given how thoroughly that single incident had confirmed our worst, previously unspoken fears about that mysterious car parked in our driveway over those preceding weeks. We ended up installing motion-activated lighting around the entire perimeter of the house, along with a proper security camera system covering every angle of the property, especially focused on that same side window and the long stretch of driveway where the mystery vehicle had kept appearing. Beyond the physical security upgrades, we also made a few smaller, more immediate changes to our nightly routines. We started keeping that particular side window locked and closed after dark, regardless of how warm the evening happened to be. Something neither of us had ever thought twice about before that incident, given how comfortable it usually was to leave it open for the breeze. We also agreed, without much discussion needed, that neither of us would spend those late-night hours quite so exposed and vulnerable near open windows again. A small but meaningful adjustment that felt necessary after everything that had happened. We also reported the entire incident thoroughly to the sheriff's department, providing as much detail as I could recall about the person's hands, their general approach to the window, and everything else I could remember from that brief but intensely vivid encounter. Unfortunately, without ever having gotten a clear look at the person's actual face beyond that first split second before he fled. There wasn't much concrete information the department could realistically act on beyond simply logging the report and increasing patrol frequency through our particular stretch of road for a while afterward. The deputy who came out to take our statement seemed genuinely concerned, connecting it fairly quickly to the earlier reports we'd already filed about the mysterious car in our driveway, though even he admitted there simply wasn't enough concrete evidence tying the two incidents together definitively enough to pursue any further formal investigation beyond what we'd already provided. In the months that followed, that mysterious car never returned to our driveway again, and we never experienced anything else resembling that same window incident either. Whether that person had simply been the same individual responsible for the earlier driveway parking, finally working up the nerve to attempt something more serious that particular night, or whether it was some entirely separate, unrelated individual who simply happened to target our house for reasons we'll likely never fully understand, remains something neither my husband nor I have ever gotten a clear answer to. A question that still occasionally comes up, between us even now, years later, whenever that particular summer happens to be mentioned in passing conversation. What I do know with absolute certainty is that the specific combination of circumstances surrounding that entire summer, the grief, the unemployment, the sleepless nights, and that persistent unresolved unease about our driveway, all came together in a way that left me primed and ready to react instantly and decisively the moment actual danger finally presented itself directly at that window. I've thought many times since about whether I would have reacted quite so quickly and effectively under more ordinary circumstances, well rested and less consumed by grief and stress, and honestly, I'm not entirely sure I would have. There's something strange and almost darkly ironic about realizing that the worst period of my life up to that point, marked by profound loss and uncertainty, ended up inadvertently preparing me for that exact critical moment when I needed to react with complete, unhesitating speed and decisiveness. I don't think I'll ever fully untangle whether that heightened readiness was ultimately a positive outcome born from an otherwise terrible summer, or simply a coincidental byproduct of circumstances that happened to align in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment. And honestly, I'm not sure it matters much either way, given how grateful I ultimately am that things unfolded the way they did. Even now, years removed from that particular summer, I still find myself instinctively glancing toward that same side window whenever I'm sitting in our living room late at night, an automatic habit that developed directly from that single, intense encounter. My husband has commented more than once on how much more alert and security conscious I've become since that night, always double-checking locked doors and windows before settling in for the evening, always keeping at least one firearm reasonably close and accessible, regardless of what time of day or night it happens to be, a habit that has never fully faded even years later. Long after the immediate fear from that specific summer eventually settled into something more manageable. I don't know who that person was, why they'd apparently been watching our house closely enough beforehand to know exactly when to attempt getting inside, or what their actual intentions were once they got that screen popped loose from the window frame. I don't know if they were the same individual responsible for that mysterious car repeatedly appearing in our driveway over those preceding weeks, or someone else entirely with no connection to that earlier pattern at all. What I do know is that whoever they were, they clearly hadn't anticipated finding themselves staring directly down the barrel of a loaded gun the very instant they finally worked up the courage to try getting inside, and given how quickly and completely they disappeared afterward, never to be seen near our property again. I have to assume that particular encounter left just as lasting and unsettling an impression on them as it did on me. I've thought many times since about what exactly might have happened if I hadn't reacted quite so quickly that night, if I'd frozen instead of moving, or if that gun hadn't already been in my hands, loaded and ready, at the exact moment those hands appeared at the window. It's not a line of thinking I let myself follow too far, honestly, since dwelling on it too long tends to bring back that same sharp, immediate fear I felt in the actual moment itself. But it's impossible not to occasionally wonder just how differently that particular summer night could have ended under only slightly different circumstances. Even now, whenever a summer rolls around and I find myself thinking back on that particular period of grief and upheaval, that single night at the window remains the one memory that stands out most vividly of all. A strange, singular moment of pure instinct and adrenaline, carved out of an otherwise long, difficult stretch of sadness and uncertainty. One I doubt I'll ever fully stop replaying whenever I find myself sitting alone in that same living room late at night, gun or no gun within reach. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, my family lived in a house tucked away within a small, somewhat hidden neighborhood situated on a quiet cul-de-sac. The property itself had an unusually huge backyard. But tucked away in one specific corner of that yard sat an old, rusted-out flatbed trailer, the kind normally used for towing dirt bikes or similar equipment. That particular corner of the yard always gave off a distinctly unsettling feeling to all of us, enough that none of us ever really ventured over there, and even our family dog seemed to actively avoid that specific area entirely. My two younger sisters shared a bedroom together at the time, but every so often they would end up coming to sleep in my room instead, always explaining that they kept seeing strange, unexplainable lights appearing within their own room. My parents generally brushed off their concerns, assuming it was simply the effect of nearby streetlights shining through their bedroom window and disturbing them at night. One particular night, I woke up suddenly, overcome with an unusual, distinct feeling of anger, though notably it was not my own anger I was experiencing. It felt more like the specific sensation you get standing directly next to someone who is furious, practically radiating hostility toward you personally. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness of my room, I noticed the clear outline of a person standing in my bedroom doorway, along with a single small point of red light glowing steadily, similar in appearance to the lit end of a burning cigarette. Both of my parents smoked at the time, so my very first assumption was that one of them must be standing there in my doorway for some reason. I sat up in bed and called out, asking if it was Mom or Dad standing there. There was no response whatsoever. Almost immediately after I spoke, both the shadowy figure and that small glowing red light vanished completely from the doorway. I quickly pulled my covers up over my head, curling myself into as small and tight a ball as I possibly could manage underneath the blankets. Then, I felt something tug sharply at the blankets near the foot of my bed. I quickly pulled the blankets back down slightly to look, and immediately felt another distinct tug. I was completely terrified at that point, too frightened to move at all. So I simply gripped tightly onto my blankets with both hands, holding on as firmly as I possibly could. Eventually, the tugging stopped entirely, though I remained frozen in place, paralyzed with fear for what felt like a very long stretch of time afterward. Eventually, despite everything, I somehow managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I asked both of my parents about what had happened during the night. Both of them told me they had been asleep the entire night and insisted that whatever I had experienced must have simply been an intense nightmare. Fast forward roughly 20 years from that specific night, and I found myself still occasionally having recurring nightmares directly connected to that same childhood house, especially focused around one specific area, a corner of what had originally been a converted garage turned into a den. In my dreams, that particular corner always appeared as a kind of swirling black hole. Despite the actual house itself only having a single story, my recurring dreams consistently involved me running down a set of stairs, heading directly toward that same den, always carrying with me the certain, instinctive knowledge that getting too close to that black hole would result in something truly evil catching hold of me. I also had several other related nightmares involving other specific houses throughout that same neighborhood. Dreams in which I somehow understood that if I ever went to any of those other houses seeking help or safety, I would end up dying as a direct result. At some point, years later, my younger sister and I ended up discussing that old house together with our mom one evening. During that conversation, my mother described experiencing nearly identical recurring nightmares herself, details eerily similar to my own, despite the fact that none of us had ever previously discussed these specific dreams together beforehand. According to her account, in her own version of the recurring nightmare, she would run down a set of stairs into the kitchen, where she would find the cupboard doors opening and closing entirely on their own, with no explanation. She also described seeing a man standing within that same den area, positioned in roughly the same spot where I always saw that swirling black hole within my own recurring dreams. Needless to say, once we realized just how closely our separate, independent nightmares actually matched one another, all three of us were left feeling deeply unsettled by the entire realization. I have driven past that old childhood house a handful of times since then, and even now, simply entering that same neighborhood is enough to bring back that same distinct, eerie feeling I remember so clearly from childhood. Sometimes I find myself half joking that maybe the entire property had originally been built directly on top of some kind of old burial ground, though given everything my family experienced there, it is difficult not to wonder whether there might genuinely be some deeper, darker explanation behind everything that happened during those years we lived in that house. Thinking back on this entire series of experiences now, several specific details continue to stand out to me as particularly significant and difficult to fully rationalize. That initial nighttime encounter remains, even now, one of the clearest and most vivid memories from my entire childhood. The specific, targeted feeling of anger I experienced upon waking, so distinctly different from any normal fear response you would expect from simply waking up disoriented in the middle of the night, stands out as especially unusual. That kind of specific, externally directed, emotional sensation does not typically accompany an ordinary nightmare, which makes its presence during this particular experience all the more unsettling in hindsight. The physical sensation of those blankets being tugged remains another detail I have never been able to fully explain away. Nightmares, by their very nature, generally remain contained entirely within the boundaries of sleep itself. Without producing any actual, tangible physical sensations, you can distinctly recall feeling against your real physical body once fully awake. Yet I distinctly remember the specific, repeated pulling sensation against my blankets that night, clear and physically grounded in a way that felt entirely different from the more abstract, dreamlike quality of an ordinary nightmare. My two younger sisters' earlier complaints about strange, unexplainable lights appearing within their own shared bedroom also take on an entirely different significance, once considered alongside everything else that eventually happened within that same house. What had originally seemed like a reasonably simple, explainable issue involving nearby streetlights suddenly feels considerably less certain and more unsettling, especially once placed alongside my own direct encounter with that shadowy figure and glowing red light within my own bedroom doorway. The recurring nightmares that continued for roughly 20 years following our time living in that house add an entirely new layer of significance to the whole situation as well. Recurring dreams tied specifically to one particular former residence, persisting consistently over such an extended period of time, suggest some kind of deeper, lasting impact left behind by whatever we actually experienced while living there as children. The specific, consistent imagery involved, that swirling black hole positioned in that same den corner, along with an underlying certainty that other neighborhood houses similarly harbored some kind of lingering danger, points towards some kind of consistent underlying pattern rather than simply a random assortment of unrelated childhood nightmares. But without question, the single most unsettling detail from this entire story remains discovering, decades after everything originally happened, that my mother had been independently experiencing nearly identical recurring nightmares of her own the entire time, without any of us ever having previously compared notes or discussed these specific dreams with one another beforehand. The fact that her own recurring nightmare specifically included a man standing in that exact same den location, where I always envisioned that swirling black hole, strongly suggests some kind of genuine, shared connection between our separate experiences. Rather than simply representing three unrelated cases of anxiety-related nightmares coincidentally overlapping by pure chance. I still do not have any clear, definitive explanation for everything my family experienced during those specific years living in that particular house. Whether it truly was built on some kind of old burial ground, as I have sometimes joked about, or whether some other explanation entirely accounts for everything that happened, remains something none of us has ever been able to fully determine. What I do know is that even now, simply driving past that old neighborhood is enough to bring back that same distinct, lingering sense of unease, a feeling that has never fully faded, even decades removed from that single terrifying night when I woke up to find an angry, shadowy figure standing silently in my bedroom doorway. Looking back on that particular semester, I remember feeling genuinely fortunate about the room assignment itself, since most other students in that same dormitory building were crammed two, sometimes even three, to a single small room, while I had that entire corner space entirely to myself for reasons I never fully understood beyond simple luck of the draw during housing assignments. The building's age was noticeable in almost every corner of it. Creaky wooden floors that groaned with every step, old-fashioned radiators that clanked loudly whenever the heating kicked on during colder months, and windows with those same old-style blinds that always seemed slightly too large for their frames, rattling faintly whenever any real breeze passed through. A sound I had grown so used to over the semester that I barely registered it anymore under normal circumstances. I lived in a dormitory building that had originally been constructed sometime back in the 1920s, and through a stroke of good fortune, I managed to secure one of the corner rooms for myself, generally considered one of the better spots in the entire building. For a full semester, I ended up without an assigned roommate, leaving me with an unusually spacious room entirely to myself, rather than having to share it the way most other students in the dorm did that particular year. One particular night, sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly to the sound of a strange, unfamiliar noise. It repeated itself at fairly consistent intervals, roughly every 30 to 40 seconds or so, a soft but distinct sound that immediately pulled me out of whatever sleep I'd been in. My first instinct was to assume it was simply the blinds scraping gently against the sides of the window frames, since it was the middle of August in North Carolina, and the building had no air conditioning to speak of. I'd left all 3 windows in my room open that night to let in whatever breeze I could manage, and it seemed reasonable enough that the fabric or plastic slats of the blinds might occasionally brush against the window frame as air moved through the room. One particular night, sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly to the sound of a strange, unfamiliar noise. It repeated itself at fairly consistent intervals, roughly every 30 to 40 seconds or so, a soft but distinct sound that immediately pulled me out of whatever sleep I'd been in. My first instinct was to assume it was simply the blinds scraping gently against the sides of the window frames. Since it was the middle of August in North Carolina, and the building had no air conditioning to speak of, I'd left all 3 windows in my room open that night to let in whatever breeze I could manage, and it seemed reasonable enough that the fabric or plastic slats of the blinds might occasionally brush against the window frame as air moved through the room. August nights in that part of North Carolina carry their own particular kind of heavy, humid stillness, occasionally broken by a light breeze that would drift through open windows just enough to stir curtains and blinds without ever really cooling the room down much at all. I remember lying there for a moment in that groggy, half-awake state, trying to place the sound before my mind had fully caught up to being conscious, my first assumption, simply defaulting to whatever explanation, required the least amount of actual investigation. Curious enough to actually confirm that assumption, I focused my attention on the blinds hanging at the foot of my bed, watching them closely as I waited for the next occurrence of that same sound. Sure enough, the noise happened again right on schedule, but the blinds themselves remained completely still throughout, showing absolutely no movement whatsoever that could account for the sound I'd just heard. Confused, I checked the second window, and then the third, watching each set of blinds carefully as the same noise repeated itself several more times. In every single instance, none of the blinds in any of the three windows moved even slightly, completely ruling out my original, comfortable explanation. Genuinely puzzled at this point, I decided to focus more intently on the actual sound itself, trying to figure out exactly what it was I was hearing. If you tried to pronounce it yourself, speaking slowly in a low, raspy, whispering tone, it would come out sounding something very close to Shemanese, three distinct syllables repeated at that same steady 30 to 40-second interval. I listened carefully to it happen another 5 or 6 times, my mind working through various possible explanations, eventually landing on the assumption that it was probably just someone outside my window messing with me. Perhaps a fellow student pulling some kind of late-night prank, whispering that same strange phrase repeatedly from somewhere just outside my room in an attempt to spook me. I remember lying there in the dark, straining to catch every subtle inflection of that whispered phrase, trying to determine whether the voice sounded male or female, young or old, anything that might help me identify who could possibly be responsible if it really was some kind of elaborate prank. The voice itself was difficult to categorize with any real certainty, raspy and deliberately hushed enough that gender and age both felt genuinely ambiguous no matter how closely I listened, no distinguishing feature giving me any real clue to work with beyond the phrase itself. What I could say with confidence was that the pronunciation remained completely identical each time. The exact same 3 syllables, the exact same slow, deliberate rhythm, repeated with an almost unsettling precision that started to feel less like a spontaneous prank and more like something being recited with practiced intention. Just as I settled into that particular explanation, feeling reasonably confident I'd finally figured out the source of the noise, I suddenly heard that exact same phrase, Shimanese, except this time far louder than any of the previous instances, and unmistakably coming from directly behind my bed, on the side facing the hallway door, nowhere remotely close to any of the 3 open windows I'd been so carefully monitoring only moments earlier. I jumped up immediately, my heart pounding, and spun around to look behind my bed toward that same hallway-facing wall where the sound had so clearly and suddenly originated. There was absolutely nothing there. No person, no visible source for the sound whatsoever, just an empty stretch of wall exactly where it should have been, completely undisturbed. My heart was still racing as I stood there, staring at that blank stretch of wall, half expecting something to materialize the longer I looked at it, though nothing ever did. The room felt different in that moment. The same ordinary space I'd been living in comfortably for the entire semester, suddenly feeling unfamiliar and slightly hostile. Every shadow in the corners seeming to hold more weight than it normally would, as though the walls themselves had absorbed some small portion of whatever had just happened and were reluctant to let it go entirely. Thoroughly unsettled at this point, I turned on every single light in my room and conducted a full, careful search, checking inside my closet and underneath my bed, looking for any possible explanation, any sign of an intruder or prankster who might somehow still be hiding somewhere in the room with me. I found absolutely nothing out of place anywhere. I even checked behind the door itself and inside the small built-in wardrobe on the far side of the room, working through every possible hiding spot systematically, despite the room genuinely not being large enough to conceal anyone for long without immediate discovery. I remember standing in the middle of my brightly lit room afterward, still catching my breath, running through the entire sequence of events over and over in my mind, trying to make some kind of logical sense out of what had just happened. The windows, the blinds, the careful checking, the eventual conclusion that it must be some kind of prank, and then that final, much louder repetition coming from a completely different location entirely. A sequence that refused to settle into any explanation my exhausted, adrenaline-flooded brain could reasonably accept. None of it added up into any coherent, satisfying explanation, no matter how many times I replayed it. To this day, I have no idea what that specific phrase actually meant, or what could have possibly produced that sound so clearly and so suddenly from directly behind my bed after having originated, at least seemingly, from somewhere near the windows only moments before. It never happened again for the remainder of that semester, or at any other point during the rest of my time living in that particular dorm room. Looking back on that entire experience now, years removed from that particular semester, what still strikes me most is the sheer specificity and consistency of that strange, whispered phrase. It wasn't some vague, ambiguous noise that could easily be explained away as wind or old pipes settling somewhere within the building's aging structure. It was a distinct, clearly enunciated set of syllables, repeated identically each time, in a slow, deliberately raspy whisper that felt, in hindsight, almost too controlled and precise to have been some kind of random environmental noise. I've spent a fair amount of time since that night trying to figure out whether that particular phrase, Shimanese, might actually mean something in some language or dialect I simply wasn't familiar with at the time. Given how old that dormitory building actually was, dating all the way back to the 1920s, I've occasionally wondered whether some previous resident, decades earlier, might have spoken a different language entirely, and whether that specific phrase could somehow be connected to whatever history that particular room held before I ever moved into it. I've never actually found any solid answers along those lines, though the possibility has always stuck with me as one of the more plausible explanations I've been able to come up with over the years. I even tried, at various points afterward, typing out different phonetic spellings of the phrase into search engines, hoping something might turn up, connecting it to a specific language, a regional dialect, or even some kind of old folk saying tied to the university or the surrounding area. Nothing ever came up that felt like a genuine match, and eventually I gave up actively searching for an answer, simply filing the whole experience away as one of those strange, permanently unresolved mysteries from my college years that I still occasionally think back on whenever the subject of unexplained personal experiences comes up among friends. I also spent a considerable amount of time in the days immediately following that incident trying to figure out whether any of my fellow students living in nearby rooms might have been responsible for some kind of elaborate late-night prank. I asked around discreetly, without going into too much specific detail about exactly what had happened, simply mentioning that I had heard something strange coming from outside my window around 3 in the morning, curious whether anyone else might admit to being involved. Nobody I spoke with ever gave any indication of having been responsible. And given how quickly and completely that voice seemed to shift location, from somewhere near the windows to directly behind my bed near the hallway wall, all within the span of a single repeated phrase, it became increasingly difficult to imagine any realistic scenario involving an actual person physically moving that quickly and quietly, without me somehow noticing them doing so. I remember specifically asking the guy who lived in the room directly below mine, half expecting him to sheepishly admit he'd been standing outside somewhere, fooling around with his friends. But he genuinely seemed confused by the question, having heard nothing unusual himself that particular night, shrugging it off as probably nothing worth worrying about. I also briefly considered whether it might have been coming from somewhere further down the hallway, some kind of prank orchestrated by a group of students rather than a single person, though that theory ran into the same basic problem as every other explanation I tried to construct, namely the sheer, impossible speed with which the sound relocated from outside near the windows to directly behind my bed on the opposite side of the room entirely, a distance that simply couldn't be crossed silently and instantly by any ordinary person. That particular corner room, despite that single unsettling incident, was otherwise a genuinely great living situation for that entire semester. Having the extra space to myself without a roommate felt like a rare stroke of luck in an otherwise fairly cramped, standard dormitory building. And aside from that one specific night, I never experienced anything else out of the ordinary during my remaining time living there. Still, I have to admit that for at least a few weeks following that incident, I found myself sleeping with my bedroom light left on, unable to fully shake the unease that single, unexplained night had left behind. Even beyond keeping the light on, I noticed myself developing a few other small, lingering habits in the weeks immediately following that night. Checking behind the bed before actually settling in to sleep each evening, keeping the windows only barely cracked open rather than fully raised the way I had before, and generally paying far closer attention to any small, unfamiliar sound in the room than I ever had previously. Those particular habits gradually faded as the weeks went on without any further incidents, though I don't think I ever fully returned to sleeping with quite the same unguarded ease I'd had in that room before that specific night happened. I've told this story to a handful of friends over the years, usually late at night, usually in the context of swapping strange, unexplained personal experiences the way people often do when the conversation naturally drifts in that direction. The reactions have always been fairly split. Some people immediately assuming it must have been some overlooked mundane explanation I simply failed to identify in the moment, others taking the story far more seriously, particularly once I mentioned the specific detail about the sound originating from an entirely different location on its final, loudest occurrence. A few friends over the years have offered their own theories, ranging from some kind of old, poorly insulated pipe running through the walls that might occasionally produce strange sounds under specific temperature conditions, to more supernatural explanations involving whatever history that old 1920s building might have accumulated over the many decades of students who lived there before me. None of those theories have ever fully satisfied me, mostly because none of them adequately explain the specific, sudden relocation of the sound from near the windows to directly behind my bed, nor the eerie consistency of that exact same whispered phrase repeating itself identically every single time. What I keep coming back to, more than any specific theory about what that phrase might have meant or where exactly it came from, is just how methodical and deliberate the entire experience felt while it was actually happening. It wasn't a single, brief, easily dismissed noise. It repeated itself consistently, at almost exactly the same interval each time, giving me more than enough opportunity to rule out every reasonable, mundane explanation I could think to check: the blinds, the windows, any obvious external source. By the time that final, loud repetition happened directly behind my bed, I had already spent a solid several minutes actively searching for a rational explanation, methodically eliminating one possibility after another, only to be left with absolutely nothing concrete to explain what I was hearing. A complete dead end that has never once resolved itself in all the years since. I've also thought, more than once, about the specific building itself, given how old it actually was by the time I lived there. Buildings from that particular era often carry their own long, layered histories, decades of different students passing through the exact same rooms, hallways, and stairwells, each of them leaving behind whatever small, ordinary traces of their own time living there. I don't know anything specific about the history of that particular corner room before I moved in, whether anything unusual had ever happened there previously, or whether other students over the decades might have experienced anything similar themselves. It's the kind of detail I sometimes wish I had thought to research further at the time, rather than simply moving past the incident and eventually filing it away as one of those strange, unexplained memories from my college years that I still can't fully account for. A small regret that occasionally resurfaces whenever I find myself retelling the story to someone new. Even now, so many years removed from that particular semester, I still find myself thinking about that exact specific phrase every so often, usually triggered by nothing more significant than an old building creaking somewhere nearby, or the sound of blinds gently rustling against the window frame during a warm summer evening. I don't know if I'll ever come across any kind of explanation that fully satisfies my curiosity about what that phrase actually meant, or why it happened only that single time before never repeating itself again for the rest of my time living in that particular room. What I do know is that the memory itself has remained remarkably clear and consistent over all these years, refusing to blur or fade the way so many other, more mundane memories from that same period of my life eventually have, staying just as sharp and specific in my mind now as it felt standing there, wide awake, in that suddenly brightly lit room at 3 in the morning all those years ago. Looking back on it, our house has always carried something of a strange reputation within our family, the kind of low-level, ongoing story that gets brought up occasionally at family gatherings without ever really being taken too seriously by most of us on a day-to-day basis. Different family members over the years have described various small, unexplained occurrences. Objects moving slightly out of place, strange cold spots in certain rooms, that sort of thing, though nothing ever quite as dramatic or as thoroughly documented as what happened that particular night between my mom and my sister. My house is supposedly haunted, according to family legend that has circulated for years, though I, personally, have never witnessed anything unusual there myself. A psychic who once visited apparently claimed that whatever presence occupies our house specifically fears men, an oddly specific detail that has stuck with our family ever since, regardless of whether any of us fully believe it. A psychic who once visited apparently claimed that whatever presence occupies our house specifically fears men, an oddly specific detail that has stuck with our family ever since, regardless of whether any of us fully believe it. I've never actually met this particular psychic myself, since the visit apparently happened before I was old enough to really remember it clearly, but the story of that reading has been repeated often enough within the family that the specific detail about the house's ghost-fearing men has become something of a running joke among us, brought up half seriously whenever anything strange happens, while only women happen to be present in the house. A small, recurring bit of family humor that somehow makes the whole haunted house situation feel a little less frightening and a little more familiar, despite my own lack of direct experience with anything paranormal in that house. The single freakiest incident connected to it happened one particular night after my sister moved back in to live with my mom. At that point, it was just the two of them living there together, my sister occupying her bedroom on one side of the house, my mom in her own bedroom on the completely opposite side. One night, my sister was lying in bed, unable to fall asleep, when she suddenly became overwhelmed by a strange, unsettling feeling that someone else was somewhere in the house with them. It felt, she later described, almost exactly like the sensation you get when you can somehow sense that someone has come home and is quietly moving through the house without bothering to turn on any lights. That particular instinctive awareness of another person's presence, even without any direct visual or auditory confirmation. She's told me since that the feeling wasn't sudden or startling in the way you might expect. No loud noise, no obvious trigger, just a gradual mounting certainty that something in the house had changed, that the usual stillness of nighttime had somehow been disrupted, despite everything appearing outwardly the same. She said she tried, at first, to simply dismiss it and go back to trying to fall asleep, telling herself it was probably nothing more than an overactive imagination combined with the general unfamiliarity of having just moved back into the house after living elsewhere for a while. An explanation that only held up for a few more minutes before the feeling grew too strong to ignore any longer. As that unsettling feeling continued to grow, my sister became increasingly nervous, eventually deciding she couldn't simply lie there in bed and ignore it any longer. She quietly got up and made her way across the house toward my mom's bedroom, moving carefully through the darkness, since every single light in the house remained completely off the entire time. Once she reached my mom's room, she gently woke her up, delivering the classic, quietly panicked line that anyone who has ever felt genuinely spooked in their own home has probably said at some point. Something along the lines of, "Mom, I think somebody else is in here." My mom, who had experienced various paranormal occurrences in that particular house over the years already, wasn't necessarily as immediately alarmed as my sister was in that moment, having grown somewhat accustomed to the house's strange reputation over time. Still, taking absolutely no chances given the possibility that this specific situation might involve something far more mundane and dangerous than a ghost, like an actual physical intruder inside the house. My mom grabbed her cell phone and had 911 already queued up and ready to dial at a moment's notice. I think that particular detail, my mom's calm but immediately practical response, says a lot about how she's learned to navigate living in a house with such a strange reputation over the years, rather than assuming automatically that any unusual feeling must be paranormal in nature. She's apparently developed a habit of treating every situation seriously enough to rule out actual physical danger first, only considering the possibility of something supernatural once she's confirmed there's no real, tangible threat present. That kind of measured, careful response feels, to me, like exactly the right approach, given how genuinely unclear the actual danger was in that specific moment, whether it turned out to be an intruder, a ghost, or nothing at all. With her phone prepared and ready, my mom opened her bedroom door and shouted loudly into the dark hallway beyond, warning whoever or whatever might be listening that they were calling 911 in a clear, deliberate countdown. 3, 2, 1. Immediately after finishing that countdown, she flicked on the main light switch controlling most of the lights throughout the house, instantly illuminating the previously dark hallway and surrounding rooms. My sister has described that exact moment, standing just behind my mom in the darkened hallway, waiting through those 3 tense seconds of countdown before the lights finally came on, as one of the longer, more agonizing stretches of time she's ever experienced. She said neither of them knew what to expect the instant those lights flipped on, genuinely uncertain whether they'd find an intruder standing right there in front of them or nothing at all. That single suspended moment of not knowing feeling almost as unnerving as anything they ultimately discovered afterward. There was nobody to be seen anywhere in the house. No intruder, no visible explanation whatsoever for the unsettling presence my sister had sensed only minutes earlier. What they did find, though, once the lights came on and they began carefully checking through the house together, was something almost more unsettling than actually finding an intruder standing there. Every single door throughout the entire house was left standing slightly ajar. The oven door, various kitchen cabinets, every bedroom door, the cabinet beneath the television stand, even the microwave door. Absolutely everything that had a door or could be opened in some fashion had been left partially open, none of them fully shut the way they should have been. My sister has described walking through the house afterward with my mom, both of them noticing one door after another standing slightly open. The discovery building steadily rather than all hitting them at once. First, it was the hallway closet, then a bedroom door, then moving into the kitchen and realizing the cabinets were open too. And finally, almost comically given how absurd it felt by that point, discovering that even the microwave door had been left ajar along with everything else. A discovery that left both of them standing in the kitchen afterward, simply staring at each other in complete, bewildered silence. She said that by the time they'd worked their way through checking the entire house, the sheer number of open doors had become almost more surreal than frightening, an overwhelming, methodical thoroughness that felt distinctly deliberate rather than random or coincidental, as though whatever had done this wanted to be absolutely certain its presence would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Looking back on that particular night now, my mom and sister have talked about it many times since, always circling back to that same specific detail of every single door being left ajar as the single most unsettling part of the entire experience. If it had simply been an intruder, someone breaking into the house looking for valuables, there would presumably be some kind of logical explanation for a few specific doors being left open. Cabinets searched for money or jewelry, perhaps. But the sheer, complete thoroughness of it, literally every single door in the entire house, including things like the microwave that no reasonable burglar would have any practical reason to open at all, made that particular explanation feel increasingly unlikely the more they thought about it afterward. I've asked my sister directly, more than once, exactly what that initial feeling was like before she got up to wake my mom, trying to understand precisely what had alerted her to another presence in the house, without any actual sound or visual confirmation to go on. She's described it as an overwhelming, immediate certainty rather than any vague, gradually building unease, as though some part of her brain had simply registered, almost instantly, that the house's normal, quiet stillness had been disrupted by something else moving through it. Even without any specific sound triggering that realization consciously, a feeling she says she's never experienced quite as strongly before, or since that particular night. My mom, for her part, has said that despite her own history of strange experiences in that particular house over the years, that specific night still stands out as one of the more genuinely unsettling incidents she's personally been through there. She's mentioned that in all her years living in that house, she had never once come downstairs or walked through any room to find every single door left open like that, all at once. A detail that, even with her general familiarity with the house's supposed haunting, still managed to genuinely rattle her once she saw the full extent of it. She's told me that her previous experiences in that house had always been much smaller in scale by comparison. A single object moved slightly out of place, an unexplained cold draft passing through a room with no obvious source. Small things that, taken individually, could always be reasonably explained away, or simply shrugged off without too much concern. That particular night, though, felt categorically different to her, both in the sheer scale of what they discovered and in the specific, deliberate feeling of the whole experience. From my sister's initial sense of presence through to the methodical thoroughness of every single door being affected. I've thought quite a bit myself about that specific detail regarding the psychic's claim that whatever haunts our house specifically fears men. Given that it was just my mom and my sister alone in the house that particular night, with no male family member present at all, I've wondered whether that detail might somehow be connected to why whatever was moving through the house that night felt emboldened enough to open every single door so thoroughly. Behavior that, according to family stories, apparently doesn't happen nearly as often or as dramatically whenever my dad or brother happened to be staying in the house themselves. It's an interesting enough theory to entertain, even if I can't say I fully believe it myself. My dad, whenever this story comes up, tends to joke that he should probably spend more nights at home just to keep whatever's causing all this activity properly in check. A comment that always gets a laugh from the rest of the family, despite how genuinely unsettling the actual incident itself was for my mom and sister. My brother, similarly, has occasionally offered to stay over during nights when my mom happens to be alone, half joking, half genuinely trying to offer some reassurance, given how seriously she still seems to take that particular night, even years later. Whether that particular theory holds any actual merit, I genuinely have no way of knowing for certain. It's simply one of those details that gets brought up occasionally, whenever the story comes up in conversation, always adding an additional layer of unsettling context to an already strange incident. I've personally never witnessed anything unusual myself during the times I've stayed in that house, whether that's simply because I happen to be male, or purely coincidental timing on my part, or some combination of both factors together. What continues to strike me most whenever this particular story gets retold within our family is just how completely thorough and deliberate that door-opening incident felt, especially once you consider every single specific location involved. It wasn't simply a few doors left slightly ajar in a way that could easily be explained by drafts, old hinges, or general house settling. Every single door throughout the entire house, regardless of size, material, or location, had been affected in exactly the same way, uniformly left standing open just enough to be immediately noticeable the instant the lights came back on, a level of consistency that feels far too deliberate to write off as pure coincidence or ordinary household quirks. My sister has mentioned, whenever retelling this particular story herself, that in the days and weeks immediately following that specific incident, she found herself paying far closer attention to every door throughout the house before going to bed each night, developing a small, careful habit of checking that everything was properly closed and secured, a habit she admits has never fully gone away even years later. My mom, similarly, has said that particular incident left her feeling considerably more cautious about spending time alone in that house during the nighttime hours, especially whenever my sister happened to be away or otherwise occupied elsewhere. They've both mentioned, somewhat jokingly at this point, that they've developed something of a shared nightly ritual since that incident, doing one final walk through together before bed whenever they're both home, quietly checking that every door in the house is fully closed, a small routine that started directly out of that single, unsettling experience, and has simply remained part of how they close out each evening ever since, regardless of how many uneventful nights have passed since without anything similar happening again. I've spoken with a few friends over the years about that specific story, curious whether anyone else had heard of something similar happening in their own experiences with allegedly haunted houses. A few people mentioned having heard of similar stories involving doors or cabinets being left open as a way certain spirits or presences are said to communicate or make their presence known, though nobody I spoke with had ever personally witnessed anything quite as thorough or dramatic as literally every single door throughout an entire house being affected simultaneously the way ours apparently was that night. One friend in particular, who has her own family stories about a supposedly haunted childhood home, mentioned that doors being left open is actually a fairly commonly reported detail across different haunting stories she's come across over the years, sometimes interpreted as a spirit attempting to move freely through a space, other times interpreted as some kind of deliberate message or warning being communicated to whoever discovers it. She admitted, though, that she'd never heard of quite so many doors being affected all at once in a single incident. agreeing that the sheer completeness of it made our particular story stand out compared to most others she'd heard. I've also mentioned this story a few times to coworkers during casual conversations about spooky or unexplained personal experiences, usually around Halloween or whenever the topic naturally comes up in passing. The reactions have always been fairly consistent, genuine interest, mixed with a healthy dose of skepticism. Several people offering their own theories involving drafts, old hinges, or some kind of household member sleepwalking through the house and unknowingly opening everything without any memory of doing so afterward. None of those theories have ever fully satisfied either my mom or my sister, though, mostly because neither of them has any history of sleepwalking, and a simple draft wouldn't reasonably account for something as sturdy and heavy as an oven door swinging open on its own. Even now, whenever that particular night comes up in family conversation, usually around a shared meal or during some other casual family gathering, my mom and sister both still describe it with the exact same specific, consistent details every single time. The strange, sudden feeling of another presence. The careful walk through the darkened house to reach my mom's room. The deliberate countdown before flipping on the lights. And finally, that unmistakable, unsettling sight of every single door in the house standing open at once. It remains, to this day, the single story from that supposedly haunted house that genuinely gives me chills, despite never having witnessed anything remotely similar myself during my own time spent there, and I doubt any future story connected to that house will ever quite manage to top it. I don't know what actually caused every door in that house to end up open simultaneously that particular night. Whether it really was some kind of paranormal presence moving through the house the way my mom and sister both firmly believe, or whether there's some more mundane explanation that simply hasn't occurred to any of us yet after all these years of discussing it. What I do know is that whatever actually happened that night has left a lasting impression on both my mom and sister. One that continues to shape how carefully they each check doors and locks before settling in for the night, even all these years later, in a house that, according to family legend, still apparently prefers keeping its distance from any of the men who happen to live there. A small, strange detail that continues to give the entire story its own particular edge every time it gets brought up again. I have two separate stories that have genuinely stuck with me over the years. One distinctly paranormal in nature, and another that isn't supernatural at all, but remains horrifying to me regardless, haunting me in its own particular way to this very day. Looking back, I think the countryside setting of that house played a role in how isolated and unsettling certain moments felt while growing up there. Unlike a neighborhood with houses close together and constant background activity, that rural property often felt very quiet and still, especially during the daytime hours when both my parents were at work and my brother and I were the only ones around. That kind of quiet isolation, I think, made even small, strange occurrences feel considerably more significant than they might have in a busier, more populated setting. The first story goes back to when I was 6 years old, right around the time my parents decided to build a new house out in the countryside. I remember being genuinely excited about the move at the time, mostly because it meant I would finally get my own bedroom instead of continuing to share one with my younger brother the way we always had before. Looking back now, I can recall having a persistent sense of something being slightly off about that particular house throughout my childhood, though two specific incidents stand out most clearly among all those vague, half-remembered feelings. My bedroom in that house was located directly across the hallway from my brother's room, with a shared bathroom positioned in between the two of us. The layout required you to actually step out of your own bedroom and into the hallway first, before entering the bathroom through its single door, rather than having any direct connecting doors between the bedrooms and the bathroom itself. As a kid, I had a habit of leaving my dirty clothes piled up against the wall right beside my bedroom door, waiting until I eventually got around to carrying them down to the laundry room. One particular day, I was bending over to gather up that pile of clothes to finally take care of the laundry, when out of the corner of my eye, I caught a brief but distinct glimpse of what appeared to be an elderly woman, dressed entirely in white, moving quickly across the hallway and disappearing into our shared bathroom. Almost immediately afterward, I heard the bathroom door slam firmly shut behind her. Even now, decades removed from that moment, I can still picture the specific details of what I saw with unusual clarity. The flowing white fabric of her clothing, the quick, purposeful way she moved across the narrow hallway space, and the particular, heavy sound of that door slamming shut immediately behind her. It wasn't a slow, ghostly drift the way you might expect from a stereotypical haunting. It was fast, deliberate movement, almost as though she were in a hurry to get somewhere specific, and simply happened to pass directly through my field of vision on her way there. I remember freezing completely in that moment, still bent halfway over my pile of clothes, my mind struggling to process what I'd just glimpsed. It took me a genuinely long time to work up enough courage to actually approach that closed bathroom door and check what was actually inside. When I finally did open it, the bathroom was completely empty. There was nobody there at all, and to make matters even more unsettling, I was home completely alone at that particular time, with no other family members anywhere in the house who could have possibly accounted for that figure I'd seen. Years later, long after that initial incident had mostly faded into a strange, half-remembered childhood memory, a close friend of mine drove roughly 3 hours to come stay with me for a few days. One night, sometime around midnight, while we were in the middle of playing some video game together, he paused the game to go use that same shared bathroom, the exact one I'd witnessed that strange figure disappear into all those years earlier. I sat there waiting for him to finish and come back, and after a while, I suddenly heard him let out an absolutely blood-curdling scream from inside the bathroom. He came bursting out immediately afterward, moving with a kind of frantic, single-minded urgency, and began throwing his belongings hastily into his bag without any explanation whatsoever. I kept asking him repeatedly what had happened, genuinely confused and increasingly concerned by his reaction, but he refused to say a single word in response. He simply finished packing, walked straight out to his car, and drove the entire 3 hours back home, alone, in the middle of the night, without ever once explaining what had happened. I remember standing in the driveway, watching his taillights disappear down our long gravel road, completely bewildered by what had just happened, genuinely worried something might be seriously wrong with him rather than simply frightened. A mix of concern and confusion that stayed with me for the rest of that entire night. I called him several times over the following days, and he answered occasionally, always brief and clearly still shaken, insisting he was fine physically, but refusing to elaborate any further on what had actually scared him so badly during that particular visit. It wasn't until roughly a week later that he finally opened up and told me exactly what had occurred that particular night. While he'd been washing his hands at the sink in that same bathroom, he looked down briefly to grab some soap, and when he looked back up into the mirror, he saw an entirely different face staring directly back at him instead of his own reflection. He described it, when he finally did talk about it, as an older woman's face, pale and completely still, positioned exactly where his own reflection should have been, staring back at him with an expression he struggled to properly describe, somewhere between sorrow and quiet, unsettling intensity. An expression he's told me he still occasionally sees when he closes his eyes at night, even all these years later. He never came to visit me again after that particular incident, and to this day, he's remained firmly unwilling to ever set foot back inside that house. Looking back on both of those specific incidents now, years removed from when they originally happened, what strikes me most is how consistently that same particular bathroom seems to be tied to whatever unexplained presence apparently occupied that house. My own experience as a 6-year-old, catching sight of that elderly woman in white disappearing behind a slamming door, and then years later, my friend's own terrifying encounter with an unfamiliar face staring back at him from the exact same mirror in that exact same room, feels like far too specific a connection to simply write off as pure coincidence. It's worth mentioning that between my own childhood sighting and my friend's much later experience, spanning well over a decade, nobody else in the family, as far as I'm aware, ever reported witnessing anything similar in that particular bathroom. My brother, who used that same bathroom just as often as I did growing up, has never mentioned experiencing anything unusual there himself, despite spending just as much time in that same space throughout our childhood as I ever did. That inconsistency has always struck me as strange in its own right, wondering why that presence, whatever it actually was, seemed to reveal itself only to me and, years later, to a completely unrelated visiting friend, while apparently remaining invisible to every other family member who used that same space daily for years. I've thought many times since about what that elderly woman I saw as a child might have actually represented, whether she was connected somehow to the land the house had been built on, some previous resident from long before my family ever moved there, or something else entirely that I have absolutely no context or explanation for. My parents, whenever I've brought up that particular memory over the years, have always maintained that they never personally witnessed anything unusual themselves during all their years living in that house, though they've never fully dismissed my own account either, simply acknowledging that plenty of strange, unexplained things happen in houses without any clear reason ever coming to light. My friend, for his part, has never elaborated much further beyond that single description of seeing an unfamiliar face in the mirror. Whenever the subject comes up now, even all these years later, he tends to visibly tense up and quickly change the conversation to something else entirely, clearly still deeply unsettled by whatever he actually witnessed that particular night. I've never pushed him for further details beyond what he originally shared, respecting that some experiences are simply too disturbing for a person to want to revisit in any greater depth than absolutely necessary. A boundary I've always made a point of respecting fully whenever the topic happens to come up between us now. The second story I want to share is entirely different in nature, involving nothing supernatural whatsoever. Yet it remains in many ways the more genuinely terrifying of the two experiences for me personally, even all these years later. Back in high school, I worked as an assistant manager at a local restaurant and among my various coworkers there. Quite a few happened to be young women my own age. I developed a particular crush on one specific coworker, and over time, the two of us became fairly good friends, though I never quite managed to work up the courage to actually ask her out directly. For the sake of this story, I'll simply refer to her as Sue. Sue was the kind of person who made every shift more enjoyable simply by being there. Quick to laugh, genuinely kind to every customer and coworker alike. The sort of person people naturally gravitated toward without her ever seeming to try particularly hard at it. A rare kind of warmth that made her genuinely easy to be around during even the busiest, most stressful shifts. We developed an easy, comfortable friendship over the months we worked together, the kind where you can talk about almost anything during slow shifts without ever quite crossing over into anything more serious, despite how much I secretly wished it would, always hoping, somewhere in the back of my mind, that eventually I'd find the right moment and the right words to finally ask her out properly, whenever any of my coworkers finished their shift and headed out for the night. I would typically offer some standard casual parting phrase, something along the lines of "see ya" or "later," the kind of unremarkable, automatic goodbye you'd give without putting much thought into it whatsoever. On one particular night, though, as Sue was leaving the restaurant at the end of her shift, something about that specific moment felt slightly different. I looked directly at her, and we ended up making eye contact for what felt at the time like an unusually extended stretch of time, longer than any ordinary parting glance typically lasts. Instead of my usual casual phrase, I found myself saying, quite deliberately, "Goodbye, Sue." I've tried many times since to recall exactly what prompted that shift in my own behavior that particular night. Whether something about her expression seemed different, whether the restaurant felt unusually quiet in a way that made the moment feel more significant, or whether it was simply an ordinary, unremarkable interaction that my memory has since retroactively assigned far more weight to than it actually deserved in the moment itself. Honestly, I can't identify anything concretely different about that night leading up to that exact exchange. It simply happened the way it happened, and I said what I said, without any conscious sense at the time that anything unusual was occurring. The very next day, Sue was tragically killed after being caught in an EF4 tornado that tore through the area without warning. I remember exactly where I was when I first heard the news about the tornado and shortly afterward about Sue specifically. The entire restaurant staff was called together, and our manager, visibly shaken himself, delivered the news as gently as he could manage under the circumstances. I remember the room going completely silent, several of my coworkers immediately bursting into tears, and myself standing there in a kind of stunned, disbelieving numbness, unable to fully process what I was hearing. It wasn't until later that same day, once the initial shock had settled somewhat, and I found myself alone with my own thoughts, that the memory of our final exchange the previous night suddenly resurfaced with startling clarity. That extended eye contact, that deliberate use of her full name instead of my usual casual goodbye, all of it came rushing back at once. And I remember feeling a genuine chill run through me as I recognized just how different that particular interaction had felt compared to every other goodbye we'd exchanged before it. I still think about that specific exchange constantly, even all these years removed from when it actually happened. There was nothing outwardly unusual about that particular shift, nothing that should have made that goodbye feel any different from the dozens of other times I'd said goodbye to her at the end of a shift throughout our friendship. And yet, for reasons I still can't fully explain, that specific moment felt different while it was happening. The extended eye contact, the deliberate choice of words, saying her full name rather than my usual casual phrase, all of it feeling, in hindsight, disturbingly significant given what happened to her only hours later. I've turned that entire exchange over in my mind more times than I could possibly count over the years, trying to make some kind of sense out of why that particular goodbye felt so different from every other one that came before it. I don't believe, on any rational level, that I somehow possessed some kind of genuine premonition about what was going to happen to her. That explanation feels far too dramatic, too neatly convenient, to actually hold up under any serious scrutiny. And yet, I can't fully shake the deeply unsettling coincidence of it all either. The timing, the specific shift in my own behavior during that final interaction, occurring only hours before an entirely unpredictable, devastating tragedy took her life. A coincidence so precise in its timing that no amount of rational explanation has ever fully managed to put my mind completely at ease about it. What makes this particular memory so much harder to process than the paranormal encounters from my childhood house is precisely the fact that there's no supernatural explanation readily available to make sense of it. A ghost story, however unsettling, at least offers some kind of narrative framework to understand within. A presence, an entity, something tangible enough to point toward as an explanation. This particular memory offers nothing like that at all. It's simply an ordinary, unremarkable evening that happened, by pure and devastating coincidence, to carry an unusual weight to it in hindsight, one that I can never fully separate from the genuine tragedy that followed only hours later, no matter how many years continue to pass since it originally happened. I've spoken with a few close friends over the years about that specific memory, always hesitant to bring it up too casually, given how genuinely painful the underlying loss still is, even after all this time. Most people, understandably, tend to focus on reassuring me that it was simply an unfortunate coincidence. Nothing more than my own memory retroactively assigning special significance to an entirely ordinary moment once it became forever linked to an unimaginable tragedy the following day. I understand that explanation completely, and on most days, I genuinely believe it myself. But there remain certain quieter moments, usually late at night, when that specific memory resurfaces unbidden. And I find myself wondering all over again why exactly that particular goodbye felt so different in the moment it happened, well before I had any reason at all to expect what was coming, a question I suspect I'll simply carry with me for the rest of my life without ever finding a satisfying answer to it. Sue's passing affected our entire restaurant staff deeply, and even years later, I still think about her often. Not just because of that specific, unsettling, final exchange between us, but simply because she was a genuinely kind, warm person who deserved so much more time than she ultimately got. That particular tragedy, more than the ghost stories from my childhood home, remains the memory that truly haunts me most persistently. Less because of any lingering fear attached to it, and more because of the profound, unanswerable question it continues to leave me with regarding why that one specific goodbye felt so different from every other one that came before it. I've often wondered, too, what might have happened if I'd finally worked up the courage to ask her out during all those months we spent working together. Whether that final conversation might have gone differently. Whether we might have shared even a little more time together before everything changed so suddenly and irreversibly. It's not a productive line of thinking, I know, dwelling on choices I never made or conversations that never happened. But grief has a way of circling back to those same unanswerable questions, regardless of how unproductive they ultimately are. Even now, whenever storm season approaches each year and tornado warnings inevitably start appearing on the news, I find myself thinking of Sue almost immediately, and of that strange, lingering exchange the night before everything changed so suddenly for all of us who knew and cared about her. A memory that resurfaces every single year without fail, regardless of how many storm seasons have already passed since that particular one,